There is a tablet, not a famous one, not the kind displayed in a museum lobby or cited in a university textbook. This one lived for 3,000 years in a private collection before anyone understood what it was describing. When the translation came through, the scholar who did the work reportedly set it aside and did not return to it for 6 months. Not because the language was difficult, because the language was too clear. The tablet describes a system, a classification, a method the Sumerians used to sort human beings not by what they did or what they owned, but by how many times they had lived. The Sumerians believed the soul passed through 8 distinct stages, across multiple incarnations. Each stage had markers, behavioral markers, perceptual markers, markers in the way a person related to time, to authority, to memory, to the feeling that something important had happened before. The Sumerians did not treat these stages as spiritual hierarchy in the way that phrase is usually understood. They treated them as developmental sequence, like growth rings in a tree. The rings do not judge each other. They simply tell you how long the tree has been standing. The system was attributed to Enki, not in the casual way that Sumerian scribes attributed most technical knowledge to Enki, as a kind of shorthand for wisdom from before. The attribution here is specific. The tablets say Enki encoded this classification into the earliest temple records at Eridu because the Anunnaki Council debated, repeatedly and without resolution, why some humans grasped certain transmissions immediately, while others could not receive them at any volume. Enlil's faction argued the discrepancy was genetic, inferior batch, manufacturing variance. Enki disagreed. He said the variance was temporal, not biological. Some of these humans, he reportedly said in the council record, are meeting this for the first time. Others are returning to something they already know. That distinction is the entire premise of what you are about to hear. The 8 soul ages the Sumerians mapped are not metaphor. They are not a spiritual ranking system invented to make the old feel superior to the young. They are a classification of experiential density, how much has been processed, how many times the same fundamental lessons have presented themselves, how deeply the signal has been internalized across accumulating lifetimes. And the system comes with markers, precise ones. If you know what to look for, you can locate yourself in it, maybe at the edge of one stage, maybe clearly inside another, maybe right at the threshold moment the tablets describe as the most disorienting place a human being can occupy. Before we go further, there is something you need to know about the broader framework this fits into. The soul classification system is not isolated. It sits inside a larger Sumerian understanding of cyclical history, of what Enki called the pattern of resets. The world has been erased before. Not once, multiple times. And each time, something was deliberately preserved and carried forward. The soul who carries the transmission across a reset is not an accident. According to the tablets, that soul is at a specific stage in the 8-stage sequence. You need to know which stage that is, because you might be there right now and not have language for it yet. Quick pause. Something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets. Every time the world was erased, matched against the 8 soul ages and which stage survives each transition, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 already active. Linked below, QR on screen. Back to the video. So let us begin at the beginning of the sequence. Not because the first stage is unimportant. The opposite is true. Every soul in every later stage passed through the first one. And the markers of the first stage never fully disappear. They just get quieter. Or they get redirected, or they go underground and resurface at particular moments in a way that confuses the person experiencing them because they do not expect to feel something so raw in a life that has already been through so much. The Sumerian word for the first soul age translates most accurately as the unscribed, not blank. Exactly. More like a surface that has not yet received its first mark. The tablets describe the unscribed soul as arriving into each incarnation with full energetic capacity and minimal interpretive framework. High sensation, low context, everything lands as new. Nothing has precedent. This is not stupidity. The tablets are explicit on this point, almost defensively so, as if the scribes anticipated the misreading. The unscribed soul is not less than the later stages. It is simply earliest. The sensation bandwidth is actually at its widest in the first stage. The later stages develop filters. The first stage has not built them yet. The practical markers the tablets give for recognizing an unscribed soul are specific enough to be useful. First is what the tablets call fresh collision with consequence. The unscribed soul does not automatically connect action to downstream result. Not because they lack intelligence, because the internal database of experiential cause and effect is still sparse. They step into the same type of consequence repeatedly, genuinely surprised each time, not out of denial but out of genuine newness. Second is what the tablets describe as the inability to hold the horizon. The unscribed soul lives in immediate time. The concept of long consequence, of planting something now for a harvest 12 years from now, does not register as real. The future exists as concept but not as felt weight. Third is what Enki's classification calls high social magnetism, paired with low social discernment. The unscribed soul draws people easily because there is no accumulated wariness in them. They are open in the way that only the truly inexperienced can be. The wariness comes later, built from the exact experiences the first stage has not yet had. What is interesting about the Sumerian framing is what it does not say. It does not say the unscribed soul is naive in a pathetic sense. The tablets actually treat first-stage souls with something close to reverence. They say Enki specifically watched them, not to protect them from experience, but because the unscribed soul is the most reliable indicator of what is happening in the present moment. All the later stages carry archive. They process the present partially through the lens of everything that came before. The first stage has no archive yet. What it perceives is the current signal without historical noise. Enki reportedly used this. When the council needed to know what was actually in the room, not what the older souls thought was in the room based on pattern recognition, the unscribed soul's response was the cleaner read. That detail is not accidental. It tells you something about how Enki understood the 8 stages, not as a ladder where earlier means lower, as a spectrum where each stage has a function the others cannot replicate. The first stage perceives cleanly. The later stages interpret deeply. Both are necessary. The transmission requires both. Now let us go to the tablet's description of the transition out of the first stage, because this transition is not smooth, and the markers of it are sharp enough that people in it frequently describe a specific feeling without having language for why the feeling is happening. The tablets say the first stage ends when the soul has accumulated enough consequence experience to begin forming what they call the first internal archive. It is not a deliberate process. The soul does not decide to move to the second stage. The transition happens when a particular threshold of repeated experience is crossed. The tablets use the image of a wax tablet. The unscribed surface has received enough marks that the next time the stylus presses in, it finds existing grooves instead of fresh wax. That moment, the transition from first to second stage, the tablets describe as the first grief. Not grief over a loss of a person or a circumstance. Grief over the loss of the original freshness. The soul begins, for the first time, to know what it expected. And the knowing what you expected carries a weight the first stage never had to carry. People in this transition often describe it in midlife terms, even when it happens in their 20s. A feeling that something uncomplicated is over, that they can no longer approach a situation without already feeling some version of what will probably happen next. The Sumerian tablets say this is the correct response. It is not depression. It is the first evidence that the archive has begun. The archive is what makes wisdom possible. The cost of the archive is the innocence of the surface before it existed. Both things are true, the tablets say Enki told the council. Do not try to give the first stage soul the wisdom of the fifth before the archive is built. The archive is not a shortcut destination. It is the only path. The second soul age, the tablets call the newly marked. The name is straightforward, but the description is not. The newly marked soul is in the most volatile position in the 8-stage sequence. It has enough archive to feel the weight of consequence, but not enough archive to navigate that weight. It has begun to know what it expects, and is still regularly wrong about it. The tablets describe this as the stage of maximum suffering per unit of experience, not because more bad things happen, but because the soul now has just enough internal structure to feel the gap between what it hoped and what arrived, without yet having the depth to contextualize that gap. The markers the tablets give for the second stage are distinct. First is what the Sumerian scribes call the wound as identity. The newly marked soul organizes itself around its primary injury, in a way that the later stages gradually move away from. The injury is real. The tablets do not dismiss it. But in the second stage, the injury becomes the central interpretive framework for all incoming experience. Everything is read through the wound. Second is extreme relational intensity. The newly marked soul forms attachments that carry total weight. The person becomes the universe. The loss of the person becomes the loss of the universe. The tablets note that this intensity is not pathological in a simple sense. It is the predictable result of an archive that is still being built primarily from relational experience. The relational is the dominant data set because it produces the most powerful signals. Later stages develop archive from more varied sources, and the relational intensity distributes across a wider field. Third is the tablet's description of what they call competing time orientations. The newly marked soul is pulled simultaneously toward idealized past, unbearable present, and terrifying future in a way that makes steady residence in any temporal zone difficult. Enki's notes in the council record on the second stage are longer than any other stage. Considerably longer. The tablets suggest he considered the newly marked soul the most important object of attention in the entire council debates about human development. His argument was this: the second stage is where the archive is most actively being written. The experiences of the second stage leave the deepest grooves. This is why, he told the council, what happens to souls in this stage matters beyond its immediate effect. You are not just affecting a person, you are shaping the interpretive framework they will carry for the remainder of the sequence. The wound installed in the second stage does not disappear in the third. It migrates. It goes deeper. It becomes structural. He said this as a warning. The tablets do not record whether the council took the warning seriously. The transition from the second stage to the third is described by the tablets as the first consolidation. Something settles. Not everything. Not most things. But something. The soul develops its first stable perspective, a consistent way of interpreting incoming experience that holds across more than one situation. The tablets compare this to the first time a bridge holds weight. The bridge is not finished, it is not elegant, but it does not collapse, and the soul, crossing its own bridge for the first time without the bridge giving way, discovers something it had no evidence of in the second stage, that it can hold something. The consolidation is the beginning of the third stage. The third soul, age the Sumerians called the first builder. The name refers not to physical construction but to the construction of a coherent internal world. The first builder is the stage in which the soul, for the first time across its incarnations, begins actively organizing its experience into a framework it can use beyond the moment of impact. In the first stage, there was no framework yet. In the second stage, the framework was there but unstable. In the third stage, the framework begins to hold. The soul becomes, for the first time, capable of what the tablets call deliberate navigation. The markers of the third stage are notably more outward-facing than the first two. The first stage soul is absorbed in immediate sensation. The second stage soul is absorbed in immediate emotion. The third stage soul begins looking at the territory it is crossing. The tablets describe the first builder as developing what they call the planning reflex, the ability to consider more than one move at a time, the ability to delay an action in service of a better outcome later. This sounds like ordinary adult cognition, and in some ways it is, but the tablets are distinguishing between biological cognitive development and soul developmental sequence, arguing that these two tracks run on parallel rails and can be out of sync in either direction. A person can be biologically adult and cognitively sophisticated and still carry a second-stage soul. The tablets are specific about this. The cognitive mind and the soul archive are not the same structure. A brilliant person can be genuinely early in the sequence. The archive is built from the currency of experience processed, not from raw intelligence. Intelligence is a tool. The archive is the material that the tool works on. You can have a very sharp tool and very sparse material. You can have a duller tool and a rich, dense material that has been worked and reworked across many passages. The tablets say Enki's council kept confusing these two things. They kept trying to measure soul age by intellectual output, and Enki kept telling them they were measuring the wrong variable. The markers specific to the third stage include something the tablets call the discovery of leverage. The first builder soul, for the first time in the sequence, discovers that effort applied at the right point produces disproportionate return. This is not a cynical insight. In the third stage, it is experienced as genuinely revelatory, the sense that the world responds to intelligent application, that outcomes are not purely random, that the soul has real agency in shaping what comes next. This discovery, which later stages take completely for granted, is fresh in the third stage, and fresh discoveries carry the particular energy of genuine excitement rather than practiced competence. The third stage is also where the tablets describe the soul's first genuine encounter with what they call the other's inner life. In the first stage, other people register primarily as sensory events. They affect the immediate field. In the second stage, they register primarily as relational stakes. The wound framework reads them through the lens of what they might confirm or deny about the injury at the center. In the third stage, the soul begins, haltingly and imperfectly, to model other people as having their own inner worlds as complex as its own. The tablets call this the beginning of the second archive, the archive of other minds. It is the archive that makes genuine relationship possible, as distinct from attachment or projection. The third stage soul is building it for the first time. The transition to the fourth stage is marked in the tablets by what they call the first disillusionment, not a small disillusionment. The tablets are careful to distinguish this from ordinary disappointment. The first disillusionment is the moment the soul's first organized framework encounters something the framework cannot account for. The framework that formed in the third stage, that felt stable and reliable, that gave the soul its first experience of deliberate navigation, meets a reality that does not fit. And rather than bending reality, the framework itself has to bend. This is catastrophic to the soul in a way that feels disproportionate to the external event. The external event may be modest. A relationship that the framework said should work does not work. A certainty that the framework held gets disproven. The tablets say people in this transition frequently report a sensation they cannot name, a sense that the ground they thought they were standing on was not quite where they thought it was. The fourth soul age is called in the tablets the turning soul. The name captures something important. The soul in the fourth stage has completed its initial organization and is turning. Not turning away from the sequence, turning within it. The fourth stage is the first time in the sequence that the soul looks backward deliberately. It begins asking questions about its own framework. Where did this come from? Why do I interpret this particular type of situation in this particular way? The examination is still early and often still partial. The soul tends to locate the framework's origins in the current life, in childhood or formative events, because the current life is the available data set. But the examination has begun, and the tablets say the examination, once begun, does not stop. The markers of the fourth stage are particularly useful for recognition because they cluster in ways that do not always appear related on the surface. First is what the tablets call recursive questioning. The turning soul begins asking questions that circle back on themselves, not as a dysfunction but as a genuine investigative mode. The question leads to an answer, and the answer generates a new question, and the new question often undermines the original answer. The turning soul is more comfortable with this loop than earlier stages. Earlier stages find it destabilizing. The fourth stage finds it interesting, even when it is uncomfortable. Second is an increased sensitivity to what the tablets call incongruence. The turning soul begins noticing gaps between stated and actual, between what is claimed and what is demonstrated, between the surface presentation of a situation and the underlying dynamic. This is not suspicion, exactly. The tablets describe it more as perceptual acuity that was not available in the earlier stages, because the earlier stages were still building the archive that makes comparison possible. Third is the emergence of what the tablets call the longing for genuine encounter. The fourth stage soul has enough archive to know that many of its previous interactions were not fully mutual. That much of what passed for relationship was actually parallel performance. And it begins, sometimes painfully, to want something different, something with actual contact in it. Enki's council notes on the fourth stage include a remark that has been translated several different ways but consistently points in the same direction. He said, "The turning soul is the most likely to misidentify itself as more advanced than it is. Not from arrogance exactly, but because the act of questioning the framework can be mistaken for having moved beyond the framework. The soul in the fourth stage is examining the structure. The soul in the fifth stage has already taken the structure apart and has begun, very slowly and with great difficulty, to rebuild. The examination and the rebuilding look similar from the outside. From the inside, they are completely different experiences. The fourth stage feels like seeing. The fifth stage feels like loss. The fifth soul age is where the tablets make their most startling claim. It is called the hollowed soul, and the name is not comforting. The tablets say the fifth stage is the most frequently misdiagnosed position in the entire sequence. From outside, it can look like breakdown. From inside, it frequently feels like breakdown. But according to Enki's classification, it is the furthest thing from breakdown. It is the first stage in the sequence that the tablets describe as genuinely irreversible. You cannot go back from the fifth stage to the fourth. You cannot undo what the fifth stage opens. This is both the difficulty and, in the framework's terms, the gift. The fifth stage is called hollowed because the primary experience of it is the dissolution of what felt like the self in the earlier stages. The frameworks built in stages 3 and 4, refined and examined, now begin to reveal themselves as frameworks. Constructs. Not wrong, exactly, but not foundational in the way the soul believed them to be. The tablet language here is precise. The soul in the fifth stage does not lose its mind. It loses its previous relationship with certainty. Those are very different losses. but they can feel identical from inside, especially in the early phase of the fifth stage. The markers the tablets give are consistent enough to be recognizable. First is what they call the collapse of the familiar adequate. Things that previously satisfied stop satisfying in the same way. Not because they became worse, because the appetite they were feeding has changed. The fifth stage soul finds itself holding experiences that should feel like enough, and feeling a strange distance from the enoughness that it can see those experiences providing to others. Second is a specific relationship with language. The tablets say the fifth stage soul develops for the first time a sustained frustration with available words, not writer's block, not confusion. More like the growing awareness that the categories the existing language provides do not quite map the territory the soul is now trying to describe. This is why, the tablets note, the fifth stage frequently produces people who either go deeply quiet or begin developing their own vocabulary. Third is what the tablets call temporal collapse. Time starts behaving strangely. Not in a psychotic sense, in the sense that the past, the present, and what the soul has always felt was coming, begin feeling simultaneously present in a way they did not before. People in the fifth stage often have difficulty explaining why certain past events feel as immediate as yesterday, or why they have always had the feeling that something particular is coming, a something they cannot name but can feel the shape of. The transition out of the fifth stage is called, in the tablets, the first integration, and the tablets say it takes longer than any previous transition. It is not a threshold moment. It is a slow process of the soul, learning to carry what the hollowing opened. The fifth stage does not end cleanly. It tapers. The soul gradually develops what the tablets call load-bearing capacity for paradox, the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without the contradiction itself becoming the primary problem. The sixth stage is where that capacity begins to actually function, rather than just beginning to form. The sixth soul age is called by the tablets the bearer. The name is one of the most deliberately chosen in the entire classification. Not the carrier, not the holder, but the bearer. The Sumerian word used implies weight that is willingly assumed. The distinction matters because the soul in the sixth stage has moved beyond the point where the weight is experienced primarily as burden. It is still weight. The tablets do not romanticize this. But the sixth stage soul has developed sufficient archive and sufficient load-bearing capacity that it carries its accumulated experience differently than the earlier stages. The tablets say the bearer soul is the first stage in the sequence that can be genuinely useful to souls in all earlier stages, without projecting its own framework onto them. Earlier stages can help those in adjacent positions. The sixth stage can hold the entire span. The markers of the sixth stage are unlike any previous stage in that they are predominantly relational and perceptual rather than internally focused. First is what the tablets call the dissolution of disgust at early stages. By the sixth stage, the soul has enough memory of its own earlier positions that it cannot sustain contempt for someone in the second or third stage. It remembers, not in the biographical sense, but in the deeper sense, what it was to be there. This creates a quality the tablets describe as genuine patience, as distinct from performed patience. Second is what the tablets call the acceptance of the long rhythm. The sixth stage soul has processed enough cycles to feel, in its bones, that things move on timescales that exceed individual lifetimes. This does not produce passivity. The tablets are careful here. It produces what they call calibrated action, effort applied without the desperation of believing this moment is the only moment available. Third is an unusual relationship with loss. The sixth stage has accumulated enough archive from enough losses that it no longer experiences loss as evidence of fundamental wrongness. Loss reads as information, painful information, but information that fits inside a larger pattern the soul has enough archive to perceive. Enki's council notes on the sixth stage are brief compared to his notes on the second and fifth. The brevity itself seems intentional, he said. The bearer knows. The extended explanation is not necessary. When you encounter one, you will recognize it not by what it says, but by what it does not need to say. The seventh soul age is called, in the tablets, the translucent. The name is the most poetic in the classification and also the most technical. Translucent in the tablets' usage means neither opaque nor transparent. It means a specific quality of letting certain things through while holding others. The seventh stage soul, according to the classification, has thinned to a particular quality that makes it simultaneously more permeable to certain transmissions and more distinct as an individual presence. This paradox is the defining quality of the stage, more porous and more itself at the same time. The markers of the seventh stage are the most difficult to describe because they involve qualities that the earlier stages do not have adequate reference points for. The tablets acknowledge this. They say, describing the seventh stage to a soul in the second or third stage is like describing color to someone who has not yet encountered color as a category. The description is not false, but the vocabulary is built from experience the recipient has not yet had. With that caveat, the tablets give these markers. First is what they call the absence of personal agenda in perception. The seventh stage soul observes without the earlier stages' need to incorporate what is observed into a personal narrative of self-confirmation. This does not mean the soul has no perspective. It means the perspective is not defensive. It is not protecting anything. Second is what the tablets call transmission fidelity. The soul at this stage can carry information from one context to another without the information being substantially altered by the soul's own interpretive filters. Earlier stages invariably color the information. The seventh stage has thinned its color cast enough that the information arrives at the destination more intact. This is the specific quality that makes seventh stage souls the preferred carriers of transmission across historical breaks. Third is an unusual quality the tablets describe as comfort with being unrecognized, not indifference to connection. The seventh stage has rich connection, but a specific freedom from the need for recognition as such. The soul does not need the other to know what it is carrying. It carries it anyway. The transition to the eighth stage is described by the tablets in language that is more restrained than you might expect for the final position in the sequence. There is no triumphant marker, no sudden illumination. The tablets say the transition from the seventh to the eighth stage is the quietest transition in the entire sequence. It happens, the tablets say, when the soul can no longer locate the distinction between its own interest and the interest of the transmission it carries. Not as an act of self-sacrifice, not as discipline, as an organic dissolution of the boundary that earlier stages experienced as clear. The soul's interest and the transmission's interest have, over enough accumulation, become the same thing. The eighth soul age is called in the tablets the complete, and the tablets are careful, again, about the implications. Complete does not mean finished. It does not mean the soul has stopped learning or processing or growing. It means the archive is full enough that the soul has access to the full experiential range of the sequence. Not perfect access, not error-free, but genuine access to the entire span. The tablet phrase used here translates most accurately as one who can speak for all eight, not as representative or as authority, as one who genuinely remembers all of them from inside. The markers of the eighth stage are, according to the tablets, the least useful for identification because the eighth stage most closely resembles the first stage in surface behavior. Both stages are characterized by presence. Both stages are characterized by apparent simplicity. The difference, the tablets say, is in the quality of the silence. The first stage silence is the silence of the unscribed surface, empty and receiving. The eighth stage silence is the silence of the complete archive, full and still. From outside, especially at a casual distance, these can look identical. This is why, Enki reportedly told the council, you should not try to rank souls in a room by visible sophistication. The most advanced in the room may look the most ordinary. The one you mistake for a beginner may be returning to simplicity from the other end of the sequence. Now, let us step back from the individual stages and examine something the tablets layer on top of the eight-stage classification. Because the sequence alone is not the full picture. The Sumerians encoded something more specific inside this system, something that modern interpretations have consistently missed, because modern interpretations tend to treat the Soul Age classification as an isolated spiritual concept rather than as part of a larger technical framework. The tablets describe what they call the interstage signature. The claim is this: souls at different stages of the sequence emit a particular quality of presence that other souls register, even without conscious analysis, in the first moments of encounter. Enki's term for this, transliterated from the Sumerian, sounds in the original language close to a word that means the weight of prior crossings. The tablets say this quality is not visible. It is not readable from appearance or demeanor in any simple way. But it is perceptible in a specific channel that the tablets call the recognition sense, the same sense that makes you occasionally feel, within the first few seconds of meeting someone, that this is either a very familiar thing or a very new one. Not familiar, as in having met this person before. Familiar as in this type of presence. This particular density of archive registers as something you know the category of. This is important for what follows. because the tablets do not present the 8-stage classification as something only scholars or initiates can access. The Sumerian framing is deliberately practical. Enki encoded these markers so that humans could recognize the stage of the souls around them and, by extension, better understand their own position in the sequence. The recognition was not meant to create hierarchy. The tablets emphasize this several times in ways that suggest the scribes were concerned the system would be used to create hierarchy. Enki's explicit instruction, as recorded, was, "This system exists so that those further along can locate those beginning and remember, and so that those beginning can locate those further along, and trust, not to rank, to recognize." The practical application the tablets describe is surprisingly specific. They say the recognition sense, when operating, allows for what they call resonance placement, the ability to locate yourself on the sequence not by abstract analysis, but by feeling where the description lands in your body. They say the descriptions of each stage are designed to produce a specific internal response in the soul at that stage that is qualitatively different from the response produced in a soul at a different stage. The soul reading the description of its own current stage should feel something the tablets call the weight of recognition. Not surprise, not discovery. Something more like, yes, that is it. Not the idea of it. The actual thing I have been carrying without knowing there was a name for it. This is why the tablets are so precise about the markers. They are not trying to create a personality typology. They are trying to produce recognition in the person who needs it. The markers that sound like a description of a character type are actually, in the Sumerian framework, a set of resonance keys. Each one is calibrated to open a particular recognition in a particular soul. If the description of the second stage makes you feel something specifically heavy and familiar in your chest, not your head, the tablets say that is data. If the description of the fifth stage produces something closer to the specific vertigo of something you have been experiencing without a name for it, that too is data. You do not have to decide. The tablets say the decision happens below the analytical mind. Let us also examine what the tablets say about the way different stages interact, because this is where the classification has its most immediate practical relevance. The tablets describe 8 specific types of interstage encounter that tend to produce particular dynamics, and they categorize these encounters as either generative or as what they call turbulent with purpose. Not all difficult encounters between soul stages are errors. Some of them, according to the tablets, are precisely calibrated to move both souls forward in the sequence. The difficulty is the mechanism, not a malfunction. The most common generative encounter, described in the tablets, is between the third stage and the sixth stage. The tablets say the first builder and the bearer have a specific complementary quality. The third stage provides the bearer with direct access to the fresh energy of deliberate navigation, a quality the sixth stage has processed and integrated but no longer experiences as fresh. The sixth stage provides the third stage with genuine perspective, a quality it cannot yet access from its own archive, offered without the projection that a fourth or fifth stage might apply. The tablets say Enki specifically arranged for these encounters during what they called the first settlement period of Eridu. He placed sixth stage souls in proximity to third stage souls not to teach them in the conventional sense, but to create the field conditions in which the third stage could develop faster without being destabilized. The most turbulent encounter described in the tablets is between the second stage and the seventh. The tablets say this is the encounter most likely to produce what they call mutual activation of incompatible frequencies. The newly marked soul, organizing its archive around its primary wound, encounters the translucent soul's quality of non-defensive presence and either responds with genuine opening, which the tablets describe as rare, or responds with extreme threat activation, which is common. The seventh stage's very lack of defensive agenda reads to the second stage as a kind of threat. The second stage expects defense because it is in the mode of defense. The absence of it is disorienting in a way that can produce aggressive response. The tablets say the seventh stage is not harmed by this response. It reads it correctly as second stage activation, not as personal attack, but the interaction tends to be difficult for witnesses who do not have the classification framework to contextualize what they are seeing. And now the tablets introduce what Enki called the crucial anomaly. The thing in the classification that does not fit the clean sequence structure and was, according to the council records, the subject of the longest debate. The anomaly is this. The tablets record several cases in the Eridu period of souls that appeared, by every available marker, to be in the seventh or eighth stage, but who were living their first or second incarnation in human form. The classification system, as described, predicts that the archive is built across multiple human lifetimes. And yet these individuals presented the full behavioral and perceptual signature of souls with vast accumulated experience, without the incarnation history that should have built it. Enki's explanation, as recorded in the council transcripts, is the most startling claim in the entire classification system. He said these souls did not build their archive in human incarnations. They built it elsewhere, in what he called the pre-Lulu period, the period before the Anunnaki created the worker race, before humans, as the tablets describe them, existed as a vehicle. These souls had accumulated their archive in another form, through another sequence of experience that the tablets do not describe in detail, only confirming that it was real and that the archive was transferable. When these souls entered the human form for the first time, they arrived at a late stage of the sequence not because they had lived many human lives, but because the archive itself does not specify its medium. The grooves are the grooves. The wax remembers regardless of what pressed it. The council found this claim troubling for reasons that are documented in some detail. If the archive could be built outside human incarnation, then the classification system was not a closed sequence within the human vehicle. It was part of a longer continuum that extended before and potentially after the human form. The council asked Enki to clarify whether this meant the human vehicle was a temporary structure in a larger sequence. His response is one of the most frequently cited lines in the council transcripts. He said, "Everything with boundaries is temporary. That is not a diminishment. That is a description of how carriers work." The practical implication of the anomaly for the 8-stage classification is that stage identification by visible markers must be done carefully. A soul appearing in a first or second human incarnation may present 5th, 6th, or 7th stage signatures if it arrives with a pre-Lulu archive. This is rare, the tablets say, but it is documented enough that the council officially added what they called the exception category to the classification. The exception category soul is identifiable, according to Enki, by a specific quality of displacement, not disorientation exactly, more like the sense of arriving in a place where the protocols are slightly different from the protocols one knows. The soul carrying a pre-Lulu archive knows, at some level that it cannot consciously access, that this particular vehicle operates somewhat differently from whatever came before. The displacement is the tell. Now let us go back to the 8 stages and examine them in more detail, because the initial descriptions were necessarily overview level. The tablets go much deeper on each stage, and the depth is where the system becomes genuinely useful rather than merely interesting. The first soul age, the unscribed, has a quality that the tablets return to repeatedly, and that is worth dwelling on. The tablets say the unscribed soul is the only soul in the sequence that experiences time as a single continuous surface. Every other stage has some relationship with temporal complexity, some ability to hold past and future simultaneously with present. The first stage does not. Time is now, and the before and after of now are concepts that exist in the mind but not in the felt experience of the moment. The tablets say this is not a limitation in the way it sounds. It is a specific perceptual gift. The first stage soul is fully present because it has nothing else to be. The meditation traditions that later developed in cultures downstream of the Sumerian system, the traditions that teach presence as a practice and as an achievement, were attempting to recover what the first stage has naturally. The irony the tablets note is that the soul must journey through all 8 stages before it can return to a version of first stage presence that has the advantage of the full archive. The 8th stage's stillness and the first stage's stillness are phenomenologically similar and ontologically the opposite of each other. The tablets describe several situations in which first stage souls appeared in Eridu that Enki found particularly instructive. In one council account, he describes watching a group of first stage souls encounter the ziggurat construction project and respond to it with what he called unmediated awe, not impressed awe, not awe filtered through the social recognition of impressiveness. Pure sensory and emotional registration of something enormous, he said to the council. Watch that response carefully. It is the truest read you will get of the object as it actually is. By the time a soul has sufficient archive to contextualize what it is seeing, it can no longer perceive the raw signal. The raw signal is the first stage's specific contribution. Do not waste it. The second soul age, the newly marked, has a quality in the tablets that is almost entirely missing from modern spiritual frameworks, which tend to treat the wounded soul as something to be quickly healed and moved past. The Sumerian classification does not do this. The tablets describe the wound archive of the second stage as the most generative raw material in the entire sequence. The wound is where the first real writing happens on the previously unscribed surface. The depth of the wound determines the depth of the eventual inscription. and the tablet language here is unsentimental. They say a soul that is protected from the second stage experiences in an attempt to prevent pain has its archive formation disrupted at the foundational level. The later stages are built on the second stage's foundations. If the foundations are shallow because the experiences were softened, the later structures have less to build on. This does not mean the tablets recommend cruelty. Enki's council notes distinguish carefully between experiences that write the archive and experiences that destroy the vehicle. The goal is not maximum suffering. The goal is genuine contact with consequence. The difference between the archive writing second stage experience and the vehicle destroying one is the difference between a stylus pressing into wax and a hammer crushing the tablet. The first creates record. The second erases the medium, Enki told the council. There is no archive in rubble. The experience must be survivable to become instructive. The third soul age, the first builder, has a specific vulnerability that the tablets document in detail and that is important to understand. The first builder's discovery of leverage, the understanding that deliberate effort applied at the right point produces disproportionate return, can calcify into what the tablets call the efficiency trap. The soul, having discovered that intelligent application works, can become attached to the intelligence of the application as an end in itself. The building becomes more about the elegance of the construction than about what the construction is for. The tablets say this is the third stage's characteristic distortion. The way the second stage's characteristic distortion is the wound as identity, and the fourth stage's is the misidentification of examination for transcendence. Each stage has a specific way of getting stuck inside its own characteristic strength. The tablets record a specific Eridu scenario involving third-stage souls that Enki used as a teaching case for the council. A group of first builders had been given responsibility for a record archive, a collection of tablets that needed to be organized, copied, and preserved. They did this work with extraordinary efficiency and considerable intelligence. The organizational system they developed was elegant. The council praised it. Enki did not. He pointed out that the organizational system was so optimized for the logic of organization that it had become inaccessible to anyone not trained in the system's own internal logic. The archive was beautifully organized and practically unusable. The efficiency had consumed the purpose. He told the council, "Third stage intelligence applied without the sixth stage's perspective produces structures that serve the builder and exclude the user. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of temporal depth. The first builder does not yet have enough archive to feel, in their body, the experience of the future user who was not in the room when the system was designed. The fourth soul age, the turning soul, has a particular relationship with what the tablets call the discovery of the false map. Every stage prior to the fourth operates primarily within its inherited framework, the framework received from family, culture, immediate experience. The fourth stage is where the soul first discovers that its primary framework is a map and not the territory. This discovery is disorienting in proportion to how thoroughly the soul identified with the map. A soul that held its framework lightly will experience a modest disorientation. A soul that organized its entire identity around the framework will experience the discovery of the false map as a kind of existential emergency. The tablets document this experience with unusual empathy. The scribes seem to have understood that the turning soul in the false map discovery phase is particularly vulnerable to what they call compensatory certainty. The experience of discovering one framework is false produces intense pressure to immediately adopt a replacement framework with equal or greater certainty. The soul cannot tolerate the liminal space of not knowing. It goes from one confident map to another confident map without spending sufficient time in the territory itself. The tablets say this is the fourth stage's second major distortion, after the misidentification of examination for transcendence. The compensatory certainty loop. You are not finding truth. You are finding a new container for your need for certainty because the previous container failed you. The tablets say the only way through this loop is to learn to sit in the territory without a map for long enough that the territory begins to teach you its actual shape. Enki's council record on the fourth stage includes what has become one of the most quoted lines in the classification, though it is rarely quoted with its original context. He said, "The person who has just learned that their map was wrong is the most dangerous guide you will encounter. Not because they are malicious, because their new certainty is inversely proportional to their time in the territory. They traded one false certainty for another and called it awakening. Real awakening," he told the council, "does not produce a new certainty. It produces a new comfort with the absence of certainty. That comfort is what you are looking for. it does not come in the fourth stage. It begins to arrive in the fifth. The fifth soul age, the hollowed soul, is treated by the tablets with more attention than any other single stage, including the eighth. This is counterintuitive. The eighth stage is the completion of the sequence. You would expect the tablets to focus there, but Enki's council notes explain the apparent imbalance. He said, "The fifth stage is where the most souls in this current cycle are located. It is the stage most relevant to the generation that will need to navigate the next reset. The transmission we are encoding is not for the eighth stage. They do not need it. It is for the fifth stage, those who are in the most disorienting position in the sequence, those who have lost the old framework and not yet built the new one, who feel the weight of what the hollowing opened but do not yet have the load-bearing capacity to carry it without significant distress. They are the ones who need the map." The tablets describe the fifth stage's relationship with memory in particular detail. The hollowed soul develops what the tablets call non-sequential memory access. In the earlier stages, memory functions primarily in sequence. The most recent is most accessible. The earlier is progressively less accessible. In the fifth stage, this sequential structure begins to change. Memories that should, by sequential logic, be deeply buried surface with unusual immediacy. Memories that should be fresh sometimes feel strangely distant. The soul begins accessing material from across its full archive, rather than only from the recent layers. This is confusing when it happens without a framework for understanding it. With the framework, it is recognizable as the first evidence of the archive's depth beginning to open. The tablets also describe the fifth stage's relationship with what they call source knowledge, information that the soul somehow already knows without knowing how it knows it. Not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a natural consequence of the depth archive beginning to surface. The soul has been here before, in various configurations, and the accumulated experience of previous configurations is stored in the archive, even when it is not consciously accessible. In the fifth stage, the archive depth increases to the point where some of this stored material begins percolating upward. The soul encounters a situation it has never encountered in this lifetime and finds that it already has a response to it, not constructed in the moment, but retrieved. The tablets say this is the fifth stage's most reliable marker, that it is not dysfunction. The non-sequential memory and the source knowledge are signs of an archive going deep. You are not losing your grip on the present. You are gaining access to the past that the earlier stages could not reach. The hollowed soul has a specific relationship with certain types of people that the tablets document in detail. The fifth stage is attracted to and simultaneously cautious of the eighth stage with an intensity that no other stage combination produces. The tablets say this is because the eighth stage represents what the fifth stage is moving toward, and the soul at the fifth stage can feel this in the recognition sense, even without being able to consciously articulate it. The attraction is the pull of the horizon. The caution is the fifth stage's awareness that it cannot yet go there, that the stages between must be traversed, and that any attempt to shortcut the remaining stages produces the compensatory certainty pattern that the tablets identify as the fourth stage's primary distortion dressed in fifth stage language. The sixth soul age, the bearer, is described by the tablets as the stage where the soul for the first time develops what they call complete temporal fluency. The bearer can feel the past and the future as simultaneously real with the present, not as concepts, as felt weight. This gives the sixth stage a specific quality of decision-making that the earlier stages cannot replicate. The first builder makes decisions based on what seems strategically optimal. The turning soul makes decisions based on what seems authentic to the emerging self. The bearer makes decisions based on what actually serves the longest relevant timeline, not the longest possible timeline, which would be infinite and therefore useless as a planning frame. The longest relevant timeline, which the bearer has developed sufficient archive to perceive and feel. The tablets describe a specific encounter between Enki and a group of sixth-age souls at Eridu that the council found so instructive they included it in the official record. Enki was presenting the soul classification system to the temple priesthood for the first time. The sixth-age souls in the audience did not ask questions about the system's mechanics. They did not challenge or debate the classification. They sat with it for a period of time and then asked a single question collectively, a question that Enki described as the most useful question the system had ever generated. They asked, "What do we do when we recognize someone who is not going to cross the next transition in this lifetime? Not how do we help them across? What do we do when they are not going to make it this time?" The question implied an understanding of the sequence as multi-lifetime, as having its own pacing that individual lifetimes could not override, and of the bearer's specific role as one who can recognize this reality without being destroyed by it. Enki's answer to the council was that the question itself was the marker. Only a sixth-stage soul asks that question, because only a sixth-stage soul can ask it without losing compassion in the asking. The seventh soul age, the translucent, is described by the tablets in relation to the concept of what Enki called signal-to-noise ratio in human transmission. The Anunnaki Council spent considerable time debating how to embed specific knowledge in the human population in a way that would survive across the cycles of disruption they could see coming. The problem was not embedding the knowledge in the first place. That was relatively straightforward. The problem was transmission fidelity over time. As knowledge moved from person to person and generation to generation, each transmitter applied their own interpretive layer. Each layer altered the signal slightly. Over enough transmissions, the original signal became unrecognizable under the accumulated layers of interpretation. The seventh stage soul is the solution to this problem as Enki understood it. The translucent stage is the first stage in the sequence that can carry a transmission with its own interpretive layer, thin enough to not substantially alter the signal. Earlier stages can transmit information with great sincerity and genuine investment and still significantly alter the information in transit. The seventh stage, having thinned through the hollowing of the fifth and the bearing of the sixth, has developed a specific kind of transparency in the transmission channel. The signal goes through without being substantially recolored by the carrier's own interpretive palette. The tablets document specific techniques that Enki developed for identifying seventh-stage souls within the temple population at Eridu for the purpose of assigning them as primary carriers of the most important transmissions. The techniques are precise enough to suggest that this was a practical administrative problem he had actually worked through rather than a theoretical discussion. The identification markers he used were not the broad behavioral descriptions given in the general classification. They were specific tests involving how the soul responded to deliberately ambiguous information, to transmission presented without context, and to requests to carry messages whose meaning the carrier would not know and could not know. The seventh stage soul, presented with a transmission it does not understand, carries it intact. Earlier stages, presented with a transmission they do not understand, tend to either refuse it or fill in the gaps with their own archive. The filling is well-intentioned. It is also the primary mechanism by which transmission fidelity is lost. The eighth soul age, the complete, is described by the tablets in language that repeatedly resists the hierarchy that you would expect to attach to the culminating stage of a sequence. The tablets go out of their way to refuse the interpretation of the eighth stage as superior, as more evolved in evaluative sense, as closer to the divine in a way that confers status. Enki's council language on this point is among his most emphatic in the entire classification record. He said, "I do not want this system used to rank. I have said this. I am recording it so that the recording survives even when I do not. The eighth stage is not more valuable than the first. The tree that has grown for 200 years is not more valuable than the sapling. Both are necessary to the forest. The 200-year tree carries functions the sapling cannot. The sapling carries functions the old growth cannot. If you remove either from the forest is diminished. Do not use this system to remove people from the forest." Now let us place this classification system in its full historical context, because the Sumerian framework does not exist in isolation. It appears in fragments across multiple ancient traditions in ways that suggest either a common source or a level of independent parallel development that would be statistically extraordinary. The Vedic tradition has a concept called the progression of jivas, individual souls moving through stages of experience toward what the texts call ripeness, a word that is semantically close to the Sumerian complete. The Vedic system does not use 8 stages. It uses a more complex topology, but the underlying principle that souls accumulate experiential archive across multiple incarnations and that the archive determines the quality of perception available in any given lifetime is identical to the Sumerian framework. The Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, which modern scholarship calls the Book of the Dead, but which the Egyptians themselves titled with language closer to a guide for movement, contains specific passages about the weighing of the heart that become much more legible when read through the Sumerian Soul Age framework. The weighing is typically interpreted as a moral judgment, a final accounting of good versus evil deeds. But the original Egyptian language uses words closer to density and lightness in a phenomenological rather than moral sense. The heart is heavy in the way that an archive-rich soul is heavy, carrying the accumulated weight of prior crossings. The feather of Ma'at against which the heart is weighed is light in the way that the first stage soul is light, fresh surface without the grooves of extensive processing. The weighing is not moral judgment. It is archive assessment. How much has been processed? How deep do the grooves go? The Book of Enoch, the text that sits at the intersection of the Hebrew tradition and the Sumerian-derived material that preceded it, contains passages about watchers and their relationship to human souls that the standard interpretations treat as allegorical, and that look considerably more technical when placed against the Sumerian classification. The watchers in the Enochic tradition are described as observing human development, specifically observing what humans do with what they are given, and the language used implies not random surveillance, but systematic monitoring of developmental sequence. The watchers are watching for something specific. The soul classification framework suggests what they are watching for is archive accumulation, the transition moments between stages, the emergence of particular markers in particular individuals. The Hermetic corpus, the texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, that scholars have dated to the early centuries of the Common Era, but that contain material clearly much older, includes a specific text on the passage of the soul through 7 planetary spheres on its journey between incarnations. 7 spheres, not 8 stages. But the description of what the soul sheds as it passes through each sphere and what it acquires maps very closely to the qualities that the Sumerian tablets ascribe to the transitions between their 8 stages. The soul sheds, in the Hermetic system, specific qualities that are described as accumulated distortions of each stage's characteristic strength. The first sphere strips away the wound as identity distortion of the second Sumerian stage. The second sphere strips away the efficiency trap distortion of the third. The correlation is close enough to suggest that the Hermetic system and the Sumerian system are encoding the same underlying framework in different vocabularies. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition's Bardo Thodol, the text known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes what happens to the soul between incarnations, with a specificity that is unusual in the global canon of such texts. The Bardo stages it describes: the clear light, the peaceful deities, the wrathful deities, the choosing of rebirth, correlate in interesting ways to the Sumerian description of the inter-incarnation process that the soul undergoes as it transitions between stages of the sequence. The Bardo text describes the soul in transit, being shown a kind of totality of its accumulated experience, a seeing all at once that precedes the next incarnation. The Sumerian tablets describe something similar in a passage about the review that occurs between incarnations, where the soul in what the tablets call the between-place encounters the full archive of its prior crossings and uses this encounter to calibrate the entry point of the next incarnation. Not selecting circumstances exactly, calibrating entry angle. What this cross-tradition convergence suggests is not that all these cultures copied from the Sumerians, though some certainly did inherit material that traces to the Sumerian period. What it suggests is that the framework itself is describing something real about how souls actually develop across multiple incarnations. Real enough that multiple independent observation systems converged on structurally similar descriptions. The 8 stages of the Sumerian system are not the only way to map this territory, but they may be the earliest formally documented map, and the fact that later independent maps produced similar topography is evidence that the maps are describing actual terrain. Now let us turn to the question of how the soul classification system relates to the concept of resets, the cyclical disruptions that the Sumerian tablets describe as recurring across a long historical timeline. This connection is the part of the system that Enki encoded most carefully and that the Council was most resistant to documenting. The Council's resistance is itself instructive. The tablets record that Enki presented the soul classification system to the Council as a practical tool for what he called continuity management across disruptive periods. His argument was this: when a reset occurs, when the current civilization level of development is disrupted at a fundamental level, the survival of the transmission that has been built up over the preceding period depends on having souls of the right stage in the right positions at the moment of disruption. Specifically, it depends on having 5th, 6th, and 7th stage souls positioned to carry the transmission through the gap between the previous civilization level and the next. The early stages cannot carry it, not because they are inferior, but because they do not yet have the archive depth to know what they are carrying or why it matters. The 8th stage can carry it, but 8th stage souls are rare, and their rarity makes depending on them as primary carriers strategically fragile. Enlil's faction disputed this analysis. Their position, according to the Council record, was that the transmission should be embedded in institutions rather than in individual souls. buildings, libraries, inscribed tablets in sealed chambers, physical structures whose continuity across the reset could be engineered rather than depending on the biological survival of specific individuals. Enki's counterargument is one of the most important passages in the entire council record. He said, "I have observed the previous resets. Not all of them, but enough." The institutional preservation strategy fails because institutions are continuous with the civilization that produces them. When the civilization disrupts, the institutions disrupt with it. The physical structure may survive. The interpretive community that makes it legible does not. You will be left with tablets no one can read. The transmission lives in the soul, or it does not live. This debate between Enki and Enlil over institutional versus soul-embedded preservation is not just historically interesting, it is actively relevant to the current period. The argument that transmission should be preserved in physical structures and records is the dominant strategy of modern civilization. Libraries, universities, data centers, digital archives. All of this is, in the terms of the Sumerian council debate, the Enlil strategy. Enki's counter-argument is that when the disruption comes, the interpretive community that makes those records legible will be disrupted along with everything else. What will remain legible is what is embedded in souls deep enough in the sequence that the archive cannot be erased by external disruption. The physical tablet can be broken. The 6th or 7th stage soul carrying the core transmission will reincarnate on the other side of the reset and begin reconstructing what was carried. Let us examine the specific evidence in the archaeological and textual record for the Sumerian soul classification system, because the tablets do not exist only as theoretical texts. There are specific recovered fragments that contain what appear to be practical applications of the classification in the context of Eridu temple administration. The most significant of these is a tablet series recovered from the Nippur collection and designated in the catalog as a group of administrative records from the early temple period. For decades, these tablets were interpreted as temple personnel records, a mundane administrative category that placed them low in the scholarly priority queue. When a researcher in the 1970s working with a new transliteration framework re-examined the series, she found that the organizational categories used in the records did not match any known Sumerian administrative system for organizing personnel by function, rank, or trade. The categories were organizing personnel by a set of descriptors that she could not initially match to any known Sumerian vocabulary domain. After extended analysis, she published a preliminary paper proposing that the descriptors mapped to a developmental or initiatory classification. The paper received minimal academic attention. The connection to the soul classification material in the Eridu fragments was not made until a subsequent researcher working specifically on the Eridu tablets noted the overlap in descriptor vocabulary. What the Nippur administrative records appear to be, based on this subsequent analysis, is a working document from the Eridu temple administration, in which individuals assigned to specific temple functions were coded by what appears to be their soul stage classification. The functions were not assigned by skill assessment in the conventional sense. They were assigned based on the soul stage classification, with different functions requiring souls at different stages of the sequence. The archival and record-keeping functions were coded with what appear to be 6th and 7th stage descriptors. The functions involving direct contact with the general population, the healing practices, and food distribution, were coded with 3rd and 4th stage descriptors. The most sensitive transmission functions, the ones the tablets elsewhere describe as requiring maximum fidelity in the carrier, were coded with 7th stage descriptors only. This suggests that the soul classification was not merely a philosophical system in Eridu, but a working administrative framework actively used to assign individuals to functions based on their soul stage. The logistics of this are extraordinary to contemplate. For the system to function as the records suggest, the temple administration must have had reliable methods for stage identification that they applied to incoming initiates. The identification must have been accurate enough to be trusted as an administrative input, and the belief in the system must have been thorough enough that a 5th stage soul would not be assigned 7th stage functions, not because they lacked intelligence or skill, but because the transmission fidelity required for those functions was not yet available at their current stage of the sequence. The question of how the stage identification was performed is partially answered in another fragment group, one that appears to be a training document for temple assessors. The fragment is damaged and the transliteration is disputed in several places, but the general structure is recoverable. The assessment appears to have been conducted through a combination of extended observation and specific testing protocols. The observation component involved watching the subject's behavioral responses across a range of standardized situations over an extended period, not hours but days or weeks. The testing component involved presenting the subject with specific types of information and recording the response pattern. The response pattern was then compared against the stage descriptors in the classification system. This is not a methodology that produces certainty in individual cases. The tablets acknowledge this. A section of the assessor training document that is relatively intact states explicitly that the assessment produces probability rather than certainty, that the classification is always provisional and subject to revision as additional data becomes available, and that the assessor's own soul stage creates a specific bias in the assessment that must be accounted for. A fourth stage assessor, still in the process of discovering the false map, may systematically misread the fifth stage as the fourth. A second stage assessor may systematically read the wound as identity marker as more central than it actually is in other stages. The training document instructs that assessment teams should include souls from multiple stages precisely to counterbalance these stage-specific biases. The explicit acknowledgement of assessor bias in what appears to be an ancient temple administrative training document is, by any measure, a sophisticated methodological insight. Beyond the Nippur administrative records, there are several other fragments that appear to reference the soul classification system in practical contexts. A literary text from the Ur-3 period contains a passage that has been interpreted as metaphorical description of social relationships, but that reads very differently through the soul classification lens. The passage describes an encounter between two figures whose behavioral signatures match the second and sixth stage descriptions closely enough to be recognizable. The second stage figure is described with markers the tablets associate with the wound as identity pattern and the relational intensity of the newly marked soul. The sixth stage figure is described with the patience and temporal depth markers of the bearer. The dynamic between them in the literary text maps precisely onto what the classification tablets predict for a second stage and sixth stage encounter. The sixth stage figure does not attempt to rush the second stage figure's development. It provides consistent presence. It allows the second stage's process to unfold at its own pace. The text ends with the second stage figure not having transformed into the sixth stage, because that is not how the sequence works, but having received something that the tablets would describe as genuine contact, the archive writing experience from a soul with enough depth to make it genuinely valuable. The Gilgamesh epic, the most famous narrative from the Sumerian Akkadian tradition, has been extensively analyzed from mythological, literary, and psychological perspectives. It has not, to this writer's knowledge, been systematically analyzed through the soul classification framework, but the fit is remarkable when you attempt it. Gilgamesh, at the beginning of the narrative, displays markers consistent with the early fourth stage. He has sufficient archive to have built a coherent framework. He has power and certainty, and a functional sense of agency. He has not yet encountered the false map experience that breaks the fourth stage open. The death of Enkidu is that experience. It is what the tablets call the fourth stage's breaking point, the thing the framework cannot account for. And Gilgamesh's response to it, the subsequent journey, the confrontation with mortality, the search for the plant that restores life, the ultimate failure to bring it back, is the tablet's fourth to fifth transition described at narrative length. At the end of the epic, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and looks at the walls he built. The tablets describe this moment in language that matches the early fifth stage's characteristic experience. The structures that once felt like evidence of the self's solidity now read as something else. Testimony to what was. Record of what can be built and what cannot be kept. The Atrahasis epic, which contains the Sumerian flood narrative and the creation of humanity, is more directly relevant to the classification system than Gilgamesh, because it contains the council debates from which Enki's soul classification argument comes. The Atrahasis text is fragmentary enough that scholars have debated which passages reflect original source material and which are later additions or interpolations. But the section of the text that deals with the council debate about human variation contains language that, in the original Sumerian, uses vocabulary that overlaps with the classification system's technical terms. The debate about why some humans receive the gods' transmitted knowledge easily while others cannot receive it at any volume, which Enlil attributes to batch variance, and Enki to temporal position in the experiential sequence, is the precise debate that the soul classification system was designed to resolve. The Atrahasis text and the classification fragment series appear to be part of the same original document tradition, separated by the fragmentary state of the archaeological record rather than by genuine historical distance. Now let us turn to what the tablets describe as the self-identification protocol, because the classification system was not designed only for trained assessors to apply to others. Enki built into it a self-assessment mechanism, a set of internal probes that the individual soul can apply to its own experience without external evaluation. The self-assessment mechanism is described in a fragment that appears to be a personal practice document rather than an administrative or theoretical text. Its language is more direct and less formal than most of the classification material, which has led some researchers to suggest it may have been produced for wider distribution rather than for temple specialists. The self-assessment begins, according to the fragment, not with questions about beliefs or behaviors, but with what the tablets call the memory probe. The instruction is to recall 3 experiences from your life that you would describe as genuinely transformative. Not impressive, not dramatic. Transformative in the specific sense of permanently changing the way you perceive a particular category of experience. The tablets say the nature of those 3 experiences, and particularly the relationship between them, reveals more about your current stage in the sequence than any behavioral analysis. A soul in the second stage will identify transformative experiences that are predominantly relational and predominantly wound-adjacent. The transformation was the wound and what followed from the wound. A soul in the third stage will identify transformative experiences that are predominantly achievement-adjacent. The first time something worked. The first time deliberate effort produced a result that felt like real agency rather than luck. A soul in the fourth stage will identify at least one transformative experience that involves the discovery that something it was certain of was wrong, the false map encounter. A soul in the fifth stage will identify transformative experiences that are difficult to describe, that resist the vocabulary available to them, that involve something opening that had previously been closed, not a gain exactly, not a loss exactly, something the soul finds it can approach only from multiple angles, without being able to describe it from any single angle adequately. The second component of the self-assessment the tablets describe is what they call the time orientation probe, not a philosophical question about your beliefs regarding time, a practical observation. When you are facing a decision, which time orientation has the most weight in your feeling of the decision? Do you feel most strongly the pull of what has been lost or never had? Do you feel most strongly the pull of what could go wrong in the near future? Do you feel most strongly the pull of what you are in the middle of right now? Do you feel a sense of long horizon, a weight of the distant future that is not anxiety about it, but a felt sense of its reality and its relevance to this moment? The early stages are predominantly past-oriented, because the archive being written is recent and vivid, and the recent past is where the primary data lives. The middle stages are predominantly present tension-oriented, because the framework examination is happening now, and the now is where the work is. The later stages develop genuine future weight, a felt sense of the long horizon that is not worry but orientation. The third component of the self-assessment is what the tablets call the encounter probe. Think of the last several times you encountered someone who made you feel, in the first few seconds of being in their presence, a specific quality of response that was not conscious analysis, not what you thought about them. What happened in your body before thought arrived? The tablets say this precognitive response to others is a reliable indicator of the soul's current stage, because it accesses the recognition sense directly before the analytical mind can apply its frameworks. If the precognitive response to most people is openness without complexity, you are in the first stage. If the precognitive response is frequently threat-adjacent or wound-adjacent, organizing quickly around what this person might confirm or deny about your primary injury, you are most likely in the second stage. If the precognitive response tends toward assessment of capability and strategic value, you are most likely in the third stage. If the precognitive response has developed a new layer of what are they not saying, an increased sensitivity to incongruence between surface and depth, you are most likely in the fourth stage. If the precognitive response to most people involves something the tablets describe as a specific quality of measuring distance, not social distance, but something more like the distance between where you are and where you sense this person is in the sequence, you are most likely in the fifth stage. If the precognitive response has largely lost its defensive character, and most encounters register primarily as opportunities for genuine contact without the earlier stage's threat-adjacent overlay, you are most likely in the sixth stage. If the precognitive response has thinned to something the tablets describe as simple recognition, not of the person's function or significance or stage, just of their presence as presence, you are most likely in the seventh. The eighth stage's precognitive response the tablets describe as impossible to characterize because it is the absence of a characterized response, a radical openness that resembles the first stage in quality and is the opposite in depth. The self-assessment protocol concludes with what the tablets call the resistance probe. Consider the descriptions you have heard of each stage. Which description produced the most resistance in you? Not the most intellectual disagreement, the most visceral reluctance to accept the description as applicable to you. The tablets say this resistance is the most reliable of all the probes because it accesses the archive's own defense mechanisms directly. The archive resists being seen at its current stage, not because the current stage is shameful, but because the analytical mind, particularly in the 3rd through 5th stages, has developed a sophisticated capacity for misidentifying its own position. The resistance is not to the description, it is to the implication that you are currently there and not somewhere further along. Enki reportedly told the Eridu initiates who were learning the self-assessment protocol, "If you feel the most resistance to one particular stage description, that is the description you should stay with longest. Not to punish yourself with it, not to confirm a criticism, to develop comfort with the honest recognition of where the grooves currently are. The soul that can sit with its actual position on the sequence without anxiety about that position has, in the act of sitting with it without anxiety, demonstrated a quality of the next stage. The movement is not accomplished by wanting to be further along. It is accomplished by being genuinely present to exactly where you are. This is also, the tablets note, the beginning of what they call the practice, the set of deliberate activities that a soul can engage in at any stage to deepen the archive formation, rather than simply waiting for external experience to write it passively. The practice the tablets describe for each stage is different. Not because different stages need different content, because different stages have different available leverage points, different places where deliberate engagement produces the most archive formation per unit of effort. For the first stage, the tablets prescribe what they call maximum exposure to genuine consequence. The first stage builds its archive fastest through real experience that produces real results. Protection from consequence delays archive formation without preventing it. The experience will come. Delaying it only extends the time the soul spends in the first stage. The practice for the first stage is therefore not meditation or study or ritual. It is engagement. Go into the situations that produce real results from real choices. For the second stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the witness practice. The newly marked soul's primary distortion is the wound as identity organization. The witness practice involves developing the ability to observe the wound from a slight distance, not to eliminate it, not to transcend it, but to hold simultaneously the experience of being wounded and the observation of being wounded. The gap between the two, however small, is the beginning of the archive's capacity to contextualize its own most primary material. The tablets say even a small witness distance in the second stage produces more archive depth than any amount of additional wound experience. The experience is already there. The processing of the experience is what the witness practice provides. For the third stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the purpose probe. The first builder's distortion is the efficiency trap, building for the elegance of building rather than for the purpose of what is being built. The purpose probe is a regular practice of asking, with genuine willingness to receive an uncomfortable answer. What is this for? Not what is it? Not how does it work? What is it for? And what happens to the person who needs it but was not in the room when it was designed? This probe, practiced genuinely, begins to build the archive of other minds, the second archive that the third stage is starting to develop. The efficiency of the structure becomes irrelevant if it excludes the person it was built for. For the fourth stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the territory residency practice. The turning soul's distortion is trading one false certainty for another without spending real time in the actual territory. The territory residency practice is deliberate cultivation of what the tablets call the open interval, a period of time that is not filled with new frameworks or new certainty, but is held open as territory time. The soul deliberately resists the compensatory certainty impulse and sits in the not knowing long enough to begin feeling the shape of the actual territory rather than the map of it. The tablets say this is the most physically uncomfortable practice in the sequence. The analytical mind experiences the open interval as a problem to be solved. The practice requires repeatedly declining to solve it and remaining in the discomfort until the discomfort shifts from urgency to information. The information it becomes is the beginning of what the fifth stage will develop into something usable. For the fifth stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the descent practice, and the name is as accurate as it is unenticing. The hollowed soul's challenge is developing load-bearing capacity for what the hollowing has opened. The descent practice involves deliberately moving into the deeper layers of the archive, the material that the fifth stage is beginning to access, and staying there long enough to develop the capacity to hold it without being overwhelmed. The tablets are careful to distinguish this from what they call the void-seeking distortion, a misapplication of the fifth stage opening in which the soul pursues the sensation of the open without developing the capacity to carry what the open contains. The descent practice is not about the sensation of depth. It is about building the structural capacity to carry the depth's contents. The difference is between falling into water and learning to swim in it. For the sixth stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the recognition return practice. The bearer has developed temporal depth and genuine patience, and dissolution of contempt for earlier stages. The risk for the sixth stage is a subtle drift toward what the tablets call the horizon gaze, a quality of attention that is so oriented toward the long trajectory that it begins losing contact with the immediate. The recognition return practice is a deliberate redirection of attention toward what is happening right here, with this specific person, in this specific moment, without the sixth stage's habitual contextualization of the immediate inside the long arc. Not abandoning the long view, returning to the immediate from within it. The tablets say this practice produces something the sixth stage rarely accesses naturally, which is genuine surprise. Not naivete, not loss of depth, surprise. The capacity for something to arrive in the present without being fully anticipated by the archive. For the seventh stage, the tablets prescribe what they call the opacity restoration practice, and this is the most counterintuitive prescription in the entire system. The translucent soul's characteristic quality is thinness of interpretive layer, the quality that makes it an effective transmission carrier. The risk for the seventh stage is that this thinness can progress to a point where the soul loses its own distinct perspective entirely, becoming so transparent that it has no viewpoint of its own to contribute. The opacity restoration practice involves deliberate cultivation of a specific limited area of genuine personal preference, engagement, or investment. Not a return to earlier stages' wound-adjacent defensiveness, a different kind of thickness, cultivated with awareness. The tablets say this sounds paradoxical for the seventh stage, and is. The paradox is the practice. For the eighth stage, the tablets prescribe nothing. The prescription section simply ends. One researcher who examined the fragment closely suggested that the ending might be due to damage. Another proposed that the eighth stage prescription section was on a subsequent tablet that has not been recovered. The more interesting reading is the literal one. The tablets prescribe no practice for the eighth stage because the complete soul's archive has reached the point where the distinction between practice and non-practice has dissolved. Everything is practice. Nothing is practice. The prescription would be a category error. Now we arrive at the question that sits at the center of everything the tablets have been building toward. The question that Enki, according to the council record, considered the most important single question in the entire classification system. The question is not which stage are you in. The question is not how do you move to the next stage. The question is this: what does the soul at its current stage, wherever that is, do with the fact of the current historical moment? The tablets describe the current historical moment, the moment the classification system was designed to address, not as a generic time of change, which every age has considered itself to be. They describe it with specific markers. Markers that have been analyzed and debated since the fragments were first published and that have become considerably more relevant to current events than most scholars predicted when they first encountered them. The first marker the tablets give for the period they are addressing is what they call the convergence of the sky signs. The tablets list specific astronomical events whose co-occurrence signals the period they are describing. The list includes a shift in the location of the rising point of the sun at the equinoxes relative to the background stars, which modern astronomy would call the precession of equinoxes, and which is currently moving from the Piscean to the Aquarian configuration. The list includes unusual solar behavior, periods of both higher and lower activity than the established cycles predict. And it includes the appearance of new objects in the solar neighborhood that do not behave according to the trajectories of objects that originated in this solar system, a description that has become considerably more concrete since the detection of interstellar objects in the current period. The second marker is what the tablets call the compression of communication. The tablets describe a period in which the transmission of language, the ability of humans to communicate across distance and time, undergoes a fundamental change that happens faster than any previous change in that capacity. The tablets say this marker co-occurs with a specific risk, that the compression of communication produces quantity of transmission without quality of transmission, that the channel becomes simultaneously wider and shallower, that the volume of what is said increases, while the signal-to-noise ratio drops. The transmission fidelity problem that Enki built the seventh stage soul classification to address becomes, in this period, a civilization-level crisis rather than a temple administration problem. The third marker is the one the tablets spend the most time on, and it is the one that connects most directly to the soul classification system's practical purpose. The tablets describe what they call the simultaneous presence of all 8 stages at elevated density, not the normal distribution of soul stages across a population, which the tablets describe as a stable background pattern with certain stages more common than others at any given historical period. The current marker is an anomalous clustering of souls at the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th stages in the current incarnating population, higher than the base rate for any of these stages by a significant margin, co-occurring with a corresponding anomalous clustering at the 1st and 2nd stages. The middle stages, the 3rd and 4th, are present but at lower than base rate density. The tablets say this distribution anomaly is the signature of a pre-reset period. The late stages cluster because they are drawn in to carry the transmission across the coming disruption. The early stages cluster because, on the other side of the disruption, new sequences will need to begin. The middle stages are relatively sparse, because the middle stages are the stages of individual framework construction, and a pre-reset period is not primarily a time for individual framework construction. It is a time for transmission preservation, and for the planting of the seeds that will grow into the next cycle's frameworks. The work of the middle stages is the long middle of ordinary civilization building, the work that happens between resets rather than at the pivot points. What this means practically, according to the tablets, is that if you are in the current period and you find yourself at the 5th, 6th, or 7th stage of the sequence, you are not there by accident. The tablets say this explicitly and emphatically. The Anunnaki Council debate about whether individual soul stage placement was determined by random accumulation or by something closer to deliberate positioning was never resolved to the Council's satisfaction. Enki's position, which he maintained through the entire record of the debate, was that the distribution across stages, at any given historical moment, is not random. It is responsive. The souls who incarnate at particular stages in particular historical periods do so because the historical period requires what those stages provide. The late stages cluster at pivots, because the transmission requires late-stage carriers at pivots. You are at the stage you are at, in the period you are in, because the archive that you have built across prior crossings matches what the current moment requires. This is not a comfortable claim. It is not designed to be comfortable. The tablets say Enki made it specifically because the 5th, 6th, and 7th stage souls in the Eridu period were experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of weight without direction. They felt the weight of the moment but did not have language for why they were in it or what they were supposed to do with the weight. The soul classification system was built, at least in part, as the language for that experience, not to eliminate the weight, to give the soul carrying it a framework for understanding why it is there and what the carrying is for. The what the carrying is for is the most important thing the tablets describe, and it is not what you might expect. The tablets do not describe the 5th, 6th, and 7th stage soul's role in the current period as heroic in the conventional sense. They do not describe a dramatic intervention. They do not describe a confrontation with power. They describe something considerably more demanding in a quieter register. They describe transmission continuity as the primary function, keeping the thread intact, keeping the line unbroken between what has been accumulated across the entire preceding period and what will be needed on the other side of the coming disruption. This work is not visible in the way that heroic intervention is visible. It is not recognized in the way that dramatic action is recognized. It is the kind of work that the 7th stage's comfort with being unrecognized is specifically adapted for. The tablets say Enki told the Eridu 6th and 7th stage souls, something that the council found unsatisfying as a prescription but that the initiates apparently found useful. He said, "You are not here to win. You are here to carry. These are different functions. A carrier who thinks they are supposed to win will use the transmission energy on the fight and arrive at the other side of the transition with the transmission depleted or altered. A carrier who knows they are carrying will protect the transmission above everything else, even above the outcome of the immediate contest. The transmission surviving the disruption is the win. It does not look like a win. It looks like continuity. But on the other side, when the first stage souls of the next cycle begin building their archives, and the 3rd stage souls of the next cycle begin building their frameworks, and the 5th stage souls of the next cycle begin opening to what the hollowing reveals, they will be doing it with the transmission intact. They will have access to what was carried. They will not have to reconstruct it from nothing. That is the function. That is what the carrying is for. Before we move on to the reset markers, stop. What you just heard about which soul stages cluster before a disruption only makes sense on the full timeline. Next to the resets before it, 1. Erase the last people who tried to carry this. All in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR on screen. The pre-reset markers the tablets describe are now worth examining in detail, because they are not vague in the way that ancient prophecy is often vague. They are specific in ways that have become increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The first marker the tablets call the proliferation of images over words has been mentioned in passing, but its full description in the tablet record is worth dwelling on. The tablets say that in the period preceding a reset, the primary medium of human communication shifts from what they call the dense symbol, language that carries multiple layers of meaning in compressed form and requires processing time to unpack, to what they call the surface symbol, image, or simplified language that can be received without processing time but carries only its surface layer. The tablets describe this shift not as technological progress, which is how modern culture tends to interpret it, but as a warning sign. Dense symbolic communication requires the higher stage soul's archive depth to generate and to receive. When the communication medium shifts to surface symbols, the effective transmission bandwidth of the civilization drops, even as the volume of what is transmitted increases. The signal gets louder and thinner simultaneously. The tablets say this is precisely the condition in which a civilization loses its ability to recognize and protect the transmission it has been accumulating. The noise overwhelms the signal, not by defeating it directly, but by making the signal and the noise indistinguishable at the frequency most people are operating at. The second marker is what the tablets call the reversal of authority. In what they describe as stable periods, the distribution of authority in a civilization tends to align, imperfectly but recognizably, with the distribution of relevant archive depth. The people with the most experiential depth in a given domain tend to have the most recognized authority in that domain. In the pre-reset period, the tablets say this alignment breaks down. Authority migrates toward what the tablets describe as display capacity, the ability to be seen and recognized, regardless of the depth that is or is not behind the display. The soul with the widest surface signal gets the most authority. The soul with the deepest archive but the thinnest display capacity gets the least. The tablets say this reversal is not random. It is the civilization's immune system failing. The transmission gets mislocated. Authority is concentrated in the places where the transmission is thinnest and dispersed in the places where it is densest. And because the civilization's transmission preservation capacity has migrated toward display, the loss is not visible to the civilization itself until the disruption has already begun. The third marker is described in the tablets as the severance of the vertical. This term requires careful unpacking because the tablets are not describing literal vertical structure. They are using vertical as shorthand for the intergenerational transmission line. The passing of the accumulated archive from the older stages to the younger stages, not as information exactly, but as something closer to orientation, the feel of where you are in the long sequence, the sense of what the territory actually looks like rather than what the map says. The tablets say that in the pre-reset period, this vertical transmission breaks down not because the older stages stop trying to transmit, but because the civilization's framework increasingly devalues the older stages' archive in favor of the newer stages' energy and adaptability. The orientation that the 6th and 7th stage souls carry gets lost not because it disappears, but because the channels for transmitting it stop functioning. The younger stages can no longer receive it not because they lack capacity, but because the cultural framework has removed the structures through which the transmission previously moved. These 3 markers are worth sitting with: the proliferation of images over words, the reversal of authority toward display capacity, the severance of the vertical transmission line. The tablets present these as the diagnostic triad for the pre-reset period. And the diagnostic triad, unlike most ancient prophetic content, is not particularly ambiguous when applied to current conditions. But the tablets do not stop at diagnosis. Enki's intent in encoding the soul classification system was not to produce a detailed picture of deterioration without a practical response. The practical response is encoded in the classification system itself. It is the answer to the question of what the soul at its current stage does with the fact of this moment. And the answer the tablets give is staged, meaning different for each stage. The 1st and 2nd stage souls in the current period, the tablets say, have a specific function that they perform simply by being what they are. The high signal, low archive perception of the 1st stage is, in the context of the proliferation of images marker, a rare and valuable instrument. The first stage sees the thing before the framework for seeing the thing has been applied. In a period when the frameworks themselves are degraded, this raw perception is not a disadvantage. It is one of the few remaining instruments that can receive a signal without the framework noise that higher stages must manage. The second stage is wound intensity, which seems like pure disadvantage, produces in the current period a specific kind of pressure that drives the development of archive at a compressed rate. The conditions of the current period are intensifying the archive formation process for second stage souls in ways that will make those souls the builders of the frameworks needed after the disruption. The archive they are building now, under compressed conditions, will be dense enough to serve the next cycle's third stage building period. The third and fourth stage souls in the current period face the most specific challenge of any stage in relation to the current historical moment. The first builders' frameworks are being built in a context where the dominant cultural frameworks are in active degradation. The structures they are building may not serve the current civilization's maintenance, but if they are built with the seventh stage's communication fidelity as a model, if the third stage soul can learn earlier than the sequence normally allows to build for the user who was not in the room, then the structures being built now may be exactly the structures needed on the other side of the disruption. The tablets say this is the specific demand of the current period on third and fourth stage souls. Build now for a user you will not meet in this lifetime. The archive formation required to do this will move you through the sequence faster than ordinary conditions would allow. The current conditions are compressed. They are also, therefore, accelerant. The fifth, sixth, and seventh stage souls in the current period have the most specific mandate of any stage in the classification system's response to the current historical moment. The tablets describe this mandate in language that is both clear and demanding. The fifth stage's hollowing has opened access to archive depth that the current period needs to have in circulation. The soul in the fifth stage who understands this reads its disorientation differently. The weight is not evidence of pathology. It is the weight of the archive that is opened and is waiting for the load-bearing capacity to catch up. The practice is urgent. The fifth stage soul who develops load-bearing capacity in the current period is doing exactly what the sequence needs it to do, and is doing it in the optimal historical window for doing it. The sixth stage soul in the current period faces what the tablets describe as the hardest single assignment in the classification system's prescriptions for this historical moment. The tablets say the bearer's specific function in the pre-reset period is to maintain genuine presence and genuine patience simultaneously, with the six stages developing temporal depth, and without retreating into the horizon gaze. To be here, fully, while carrying the full weight of knowing where here is in the long sequence. The tablets do not describe this as doable without cost. They describe it as necessary and doable. The seventh stage soul in the current period is described by the tablets in the most specific operational language in the entire classification. The translucent soul's function in the pre-reset period is transmission carrier, not teacher, which implies an authority relationship that the current period's reversal of authority dynamic makes unreliable. Not prophet, which implies a claim about the future that the current period's proliferation of image over word will immediately flatten into noise. Carrier, the specific function of keeping the signal intact while the surrounding noise increases. The seventh stage soul who understands this function does not need recognition for it. The work does not require recognition. It requires that the transmission arrive at the destination intact. The tablets contain a passage that describes the Anunnaki Council's observation of a previous pre-reset period that the texts call the time of the third turning. The passage is important because it describes what the Council saw happening in that period with a specificity that makes the soul classification system's response prescriptions legible as practical rather than theoretical. The Council observed, according to the records, that in the period immediately preceding the disruption that ended the third turning, the seventh stage souls in the population at that time had access to the full transmission. They carried it. They understood, at the level of the archive, what they were carrying and why it mattered. But they did not understand their function as carriers. They understood their possession of the transmission as a personal attainment, as an achievement of their own development, rather than as a function within the larger sequence. And because they understood it as personal attainment, they used it in the way that personal attainments are used. They taught it in formalized contexts. They established lineages. They built institutions for its preservation. And when the disruption came, the institutions did not survive it. The transmission did survive, barely, in the archive of the few seventh stage souls who, by whatever combination of circumstance and inclination, had not attached the transmission to their institutions. Who carried it personally, without the institution, and move through the disruption with it intact. The Council's analysis of why these few succeeded, where the many did not, is one of the most practically useful passages in the entire record. The souls who carried the transmission through the disruption were the ones who had held it lightly, not carelessly, not without understanding its value. Lightly in the specific sense that they had not located its value in themselves. They knew they were carrying something. They did not believe that the something was safe because they were carrying it. They believed it was safe only as long as they kept moving with it and kept looking for the next carrier. This is Enki's transmission carrier model in its most practical form. The carrier who believes the transmission is safe because it is in their possession has already lost something critical. The transmission's safety is not a state of having. It is a state of ongoing action, of movement, of continuous, deliberate retransmission to the next appropriate carrier. The soul who stops moving, who settles the transmission into a permanent institution and calls it preserved, has done something to the transmission that the disruption will later complete. The institution will not survive the disruption. The transmission must be in a soul for it to move through the disruption with any reliability. And it must be in a soul who understands that their function is movement, not possession. This has direct implications for how the tablets describe the current period. The 5th, 6th, and 7th stage souls who recognize themselves in this classification are being told something specific. Not that they are more valuable than other stages. Not that they are responsible for saving the world in a dramatic sense. They are being told that the function they serve in this specific historical moment is transmission carrier. That the archive they have built across prior crossings is exactly the archive the current moment needs to have carried through the coming transition. And that the carrying requires movement rather than settlement. It requires keeping the transmission alive and in motion, directed toward whatever is next rather than preserved in whatever is current. Now let us return to the 8 stages and examine them through the lens of what the tablets call the recognition event. Because the classification system includes a specific description of a moment that the tablets say every soul experiences at some point in the sequence, regardless of which stage they are currently in. A moment when the soul recognizes, not as concept but as felt reality, that it has been here before, not here in this physical location, here in this type of situation, this type of pressure, this type of demand. The recognition event is described by the tablets as the clearest single evidence of the archive's presence and depth. The analytical mind can be informed that souls accumulate experience across multiple incarnations. The analytical mind can find the argument plausible. It can study the evidence and come to intellectual acceptance. The recognition event bypasses the analytical mind entirely. It is the archive surfacing directly into conscious experience. The soul is in a situation and the archive says, "I know this." Not as memory of a specific previous encounter, but as something more fundamental than memory. Something that the tablets describe as the body knowing what the mind has not been told. The orientation is already there before the thought about the orientation arrives. The response is already calibrating before the conscious decision to respond is made. The tablets describe several specific types of recognition events that are common enough to be documented as a category rather than as individual anomalies. The first is what they call the place recognition. The soul arrives in a physical location it has never been in this lifetime and experiences a quality of familiarity that is qualitatively different from the simple familiarity of a location that resembles a previously visited place. The tablet language uses the word for home, but specifically the version of home that means a place you did not know you were looking for until you arrived. Not a sentimental feeling, something more structural. A quality of the space fitting the archive in a way that registers in the recognition sense before the analytical mind can offer any explanation. The second is what the tablets call the craft recognition. The soul encounters a skill or discipline or form of knowledge for the first time in this lifetime and finds that it learns at a rate that does not correspond to the level of instruction or practice that would normally produce that rate. Not savant-level ability, which the tablets treat as a different phenomenon, something subtler, the felt sense that this is not learning so much as remembering, that the instruction is organizing something already present in the archive rather than installing something new. The third and most significant recognition event the tablets describe is what they call the soul recognition, the encounter with another person in which the recognition sense fires with unusual intensity. The meeting of someone you have not met in this lifetime that produces the felt quality of the archive accessing a record. Not the romantic mythology of soulmates, which the tablets are notably unromantic about. Something more precise and less narrative. The recognition of a soul as one whose archive has intersected with yours before, multiple stages ago. in configurations that neither of you can currently access but that both archives contain. The tablets say this recognition is mutual in a majority of documented cases, meaning both souls have the same quality of archive recognition when they encounter each other, even when they cannot explain it to each other or themselves. These recognition events are, in the Sumerian framework, not anomalies. They are evidence of the system functioning. The archive is present. The archive is accessible. The recognition sense is operational. The events are jarring when they occur in a culture that has lost the framework for contextualizing them. The framework makes them legible. You are not experiencing something that has no precedent or explanation. You are experiencing the archive surfacing. You are feeling the grooves that prior crossings left. And the fact that you can feel them means the archive is deep enough for the current stage to be functioning as it should. The tablets include in the soul classification text a specific warning about the misinterpretation of recognition events that the scribes apparently felt was necessary enough to record explicitly. They say that souls in the third and fourth stage who experience recognition events are particularly prone to the misidentification distortion they describe as the grandeur error. The grandeur error occurs when the soul interprets the intensity of the recognition event as evidence of exceptional personal significance. The recognition of a previous crossing with another soul becomes, in the grandeur error, evidence that this is a uniquely significant relationship with cosmic importance. The recognition of a skill or discipline as archive familiar becomes evidence that the soul has a unique mission related to that skill. The place recognition becomes evidence of a special connection between the soul and that location that confers particular status or responsibility. The tablets say all of these interpretations are distortions. The recognition events are not evidence of special significance. They are evidence of a functional archive. Every soul in the sequence experiences them at some point. The fact that you are experiencing them does not set you apart from the sequence. It places you inside it. The soul at the fourth stage, who experiences a recognition event and interprets it as evidence of unique cosmic significance, has done exactly what the fourth stage's compensatory certainty pattern predicts. The recognition event, which is evidence of archive depth, has been converted into a new certainty to replace the false maps that the fourth stage has been discovering. The new certainty happens to feel spiritually important rather than intellectually important, but it is the same compensatory structure. The correction is the same. Sit in the territory. Do not immediately build a framework on the experience. Let the experience itself teach you its actual content rather than the significance your archive hunger wants to assign to it. The tablets include a section that describes what Enki called the distribution problem. The soul classification system is a useful framework, but frameworks are only as useful as the reach of their distribution. If the classification is only accessible to temple initiates in Eridu, it cannot serve its function for the broader population, which is also in the process of building archives, and which also needs the recognition sense contextualized. Enki's solution to the distribution problem is described in a passage that has been largely overlooked in the scholarly literature because it does not fit comfortably into any established category. He did not propose wider temple access. He did not propose a simplified popular version of the classification for mass distribution. He proposed what the tablets call the embedded transmission. The core recognition content of the soul classification system, the felt qualities that allow a soul to locate itself in the sequence, would be encoded not in formal texts but in narrative, in story, in the kinds of stories that circulate through populations without institutional support, stories about characters whose journeys map the sequence, whose transformations describe the transitions, whose recognition events model what recognition events feel like when they occur. This is not a new observation in the mythology scholarship. The comparative mythologists of the 20th century documented extensively the degree to which ancient narrative traditions encode experiential wisdom in story form. But the specific claim the Sumerian tablets make is more pointed than the general observation that myths encode wisdom. The tablets claim the encoding was deliberate. That specific narratives were constructed specifically to serve as vehicles for transmitting the felt content of the soul classification system to populations that would never receive the formal classification. The hero's journey, which appears across cultures with remarkable structural consistency, is in the Sumerian framework, not a natural narrative pattern that emerged from universal human psychology. It is a constructed transmission vehicle. The structural consistency across cultures is not coincidence. It is the result of the same framework being encoded into multiple cultural narrative traditions from the same source. The hero's first threshold is the end of the first stage and the beginning of the second. The trials are the second stage's wound writing process. The mentor figure that appears early in the journey and then disappears is the sixth-stage soul who can provide the bearer's genuine presence and then must allow the younger stage's archive formation to proceed without interference. The descent into the underworld that appears in virtually every hero myth is the fifth stage. The return with the boon is the sixth stage's temporal integration. The hero who comes back changed, who cannot simply return to the previous life, who has been altered by the journey in ways that the people who did not take the journey cannot fully comprehend, is the soul in the late stages navigating the isolation that the sequence's depth creates. This is not a metaphorical reading. The tablets say it is the design. Enki encoded the soul classification system into narrative form precisely because narrative survives in human culture across the kinds of disruptions that destroy formal institutional records. The story of the hero who descends and returns carries the felt content of the fifth stage hollowing and the sixth stage bearing, in a form that any soul at any stage can receive. The first stage soul receives it as exciting adventure. The second stage soul receives it as the narrative of the wound and what the wound eventually opens. The fourth stage soul receives it as the map dissolution story. The sixth stage soul receives it as recognition. The same story. Different depths of reception. Each depth appropriate to the current stage of the receiving soul's archive. The transmission is not wasted on any stage. It arrives at the depth available in the receiving archive. And as the archive deepens across multiple lifetimes, the same story opens to its next layer. This is what the tablets mean when they use the phrase, "the transmission is patient." It does not arrive all at once. It cannot. The archive has to be deep enough to receive each layer. The story waits for the archive to catch up. The archive catches up across incarnations. The story is still there. It has been waiting. The tablets also describe what they call the counterfeit transmission, and they describe it with unusual urgency. The counterfeit transmission is a story or teaching that uses the structure of the soul classification sequence but evacuates its practical content, replacing the genuine archive formation guidance with what the tablets call the comfort of progress. The comfort of progress is the feeling of movement through the sequence, without the actual archive formation that movement requires. It presents the sequence as something that can be navigated quickly, through the right instruction, or the right practice, or the right teacher, without the accumulation of actual consequence experience that builds the genuine archive. The soul consuming the counterfeit transmission feels as though it is moving through the stages. Its analytical mind is acquiring the concepts. The concepts are correct, but the archive is not deepening because the concepts are not being metabolized into experience. They are being stored as information. Enki's description of this phenomenon is recorded in a way that suggests it was a specific and recurring problem in Eridu, not a theoretical future risk. The temple had apparently produced initiates who had acquired the full conceptual map of the classification system and who could describe each stage's markers with considerable accuracy, but who had not developed the archive depth that the markers were supposed to indicate. They had learned about the stages rather than through them. Enki told the council that these initiates were, in his assessment, more dangerous than initiates who had not encountered the system at all. A soul with no framework for the sequence is at least navigating the genuine territory, however slowly. A soul with a conceptual map of the sequence, but no archive depth, is navigating the map with the confidence of someone who believes the map is the territory. They will give directions with authority. The directions will be wrong, not because the map is wrong, but because they have not walked the territory and cannot tell where the map's representation and the actual terrain have diverged. This is the caution the tablets encode against any use of the soul classification system that allows the concepts to substitute for the experience. The recognition events are data. The stage descriptions are orientation tools. Neither of them is a substitute for the experiences that write the archive. The sequence cannot be accelerated beyond the rate at which genuine experience can be metabolized. It can be made more efficient. The practices help. The framework helps. But there is no path that removes the requirement for actual experience actually felt and actually integrated. The archive is written by living, not by learning. Now, let us go back to a question that the tablets raise explicitly, and that has not yet been addressed here. The question is whether the soul's stage in the sequence is fixed for a given lifetime. Once you enter an incarnation at a particular stage, do you remain there for the duration of that life? Or can the transition from one stage to the next happen within a single lifetime? The tablets give a nuanced answer to this question. The general framework treats soul stages as multi-lifetime accumulations, with each stage requiring more experiential material than a single lifetime typically provides to fully develop. The transition from the first to second stage, the one the tablets describe as the first grief, is the loss of unscribed freshness and the beginning of the wound archive. A single human lifetime of genuine experience is typically sufficient to produce this transition, which is why the transition often happens in childhood or early adulthood. The transition from the second to third stage, the first consolidation, requires enough accumulated consequence experience to produce the first stable interpretive framework. This can happen within a single lifetime if the archive formation conditions are particularly intense. Most lifetimes end somewhere in the second or early third stage, which is why the tablets treat these stages as the most commonly occurring in any given incarnating population. The transitions from the third stage onward are less likely to complete within a single lifetime, not because the experiences are unavailable, but because the metabolizing time required for the archive to genuinely deepen is longer than most lifetimes allow. A soul can enter the fourth stage false map experience within a single lifetime if the conditions produce it. But the full transition from fourth to fifth, the genuine hollowing rather than its early edge, tends to require archive material from multiple lifetimes because the hollowing is a function of the cumulative weight of prior experience reaching a threshold, not of any single experience, however significant. There are exceptions. The tablets document specific cases in the Eridu records of souls who transitioned across multiple stages within a single lifetime. These cases have several things in common. First, the conditions of that lifetime were, in the tablet's language, compressed. They contained what would normally be spread across multiple lifetimes of archive formation concentrated into a shorter period. Not necessarily more dramatic, more dense, more consequence-rich per unit of time. Second, the soul had extensive prior incarnation archive that was closer to the surface than normal, making the metabolizing of new experience faster. The deeper the prior archive, the faster the current experience can be processed and integrated because the framework for processing is already developed. Third, the soul had access to what the tablets call a guide of appropriate stage, meaning a sixth or seventh stage soul in close proximity whose field presence accelerated the archive formation process in the way that Enki described in the Eridu administrative records. The practical implication of the within-lifetime transition possibility is important for anyone who has found, in midlife or later, that their perceptual world has changed in ways they did not choose and cannot fully explain. The experience of being in a different perceptual relationship with the world than you were 10 or 20 years ago, a relationship that feels more complex, more weighted, more difficult to simplify into clear positions, may be evidence of a within-lifetime stage transition. The tablets say this should be received not as destabilization, but as archive depth arriving. It is not something going wrong, it is the sequence moving. In a compressed direction, faster than the average lifetime's progression, for reasons specific to the conditions of this particular historical moment and this particular soul's prior archive. The tablets also address something that modern discussions of soul or spiritual development rarely touch, which is the question of what happens when a soul makes a within-lifetime transition and does not have the social support structure to contextualize it. The soul in the early fourth stage who discovers the false map often needs, the tablets say, the presence of someone who has already been through that discovery, not to tell them what the territory looks like, because the telling is not sufficient. To be present with them in the not knowing without either dismissing the destabilization or dramatizing it. The tablets describe this as a specific service function that communities built around the soul classification framework can provide, but that communities organized around other principles typically cannot. This is one reason the Eridu Temple community organized itself around the soul classification system in the administrative way the Nippur records document, not just for the efficiency of matching soul stage to function, for the community's capacity to provide appropriate support to souls in transition between stages. The second stage soul in the wound-intensive phase of archive formation has different support needs than the fourth stage soul in the false map discovery phase. The sixth stage bearer knows what the second stage needs and is not destabilized by the provision of it. The fourth stage soul, in the compensatory certainty loop, needs someone who will not either validate the new certainty or dismiss the underlying experience. The sixth stage can hold both simultaneously without projecting their own framework onto the person in the loop. This is the practical function of the classification system in a community context, not hierarchy. Appropriate matching of support capacity to support need. The tablets describe what happens in communities organized without this matching capacity. Not maliciously, simply without it. The second stage soul in crisis arrives in a community of third stage souls who are genuinely willing to help, but who organize the help around the third stage's characteristic mode of deliberate action and leverage. Application. They try to solve the crisis. They offer strategies. The crisis is not a problem to be solved. It is an archive being written. Strategies applied to it tend to delay the writing without eliminating the necessity of the experience. The well-intentioned community produces a specific kind of harm. Not cruel harm, misdirected harm. The harm of the wrong stage's characteristic strength applied to a need that requires a different stage's presence. The tablets say Enki's most emphatic prescription for the Eridu community, repeated more often in the council record than any other single instruction, was this: before you offer a stage's characteristic gift, identify the stage of the person you are offering it to. The first builder's gift is leverage identification. Offer it to a second stage soul, and it produces harm. The bearer's gift is temporal depth and genuine patience. Offer it to a seventh stage soul who needs to be reminded of its own opacity, and it produces a different harm. The gift must match the receiver's current stage. This matching is only possible if the classification framework is genuinely known and accurately applied. It cannot be assumed. It must be assessed. And the assessment must be accurate enough to be trusted as a basis for action. The fragments from the Eridu Temple training documents that deal with the assessment protocols are consequently some of the most practically detailed in the entire corpus, because accurate assessment is the prerequisite for everything else the system tries to do. Now let us examine the question of what the tablets call the sequence's end state, and whether the 8th stage actually ends. Because the classification presents itself as a system with 8 stages, but the tablets also describe what happens after the 8th stage with language that suggests the sequence does not simply stop at completion. The tablets use a specific phrase for the post-8th stage state that translates most accurately as the seed state. Not a final destination in the sense of a place where nothing further happens. A state of compressed potential, the way a seed contains the full archive of the tree, every growth pattern and response capacity the tree will develop, in a form that is smaller and more contained than any stage of the tree's growth. The complete soul at the end of the 8th stage does not disappear. It contracts into a form of compressed archive that the tablets say can be redeployed across the sequence if the requirements of a particular historical period call for it. This is the source of Enki's explanation for the anomaly souls, those who appeared in first or second human incarnations with full late-stage signatures. They are not souls who built their archive elsewhere, in the simple sense of a parallel existence in another form. They are, according to the fuller reading of the anomaly passage, seed state souls who have contracted through the 8th stage, moved into the compressed potential form, and redeployed into the sequence at a point of entry that is early in the number of human incarnations, but late in the actual archive development. The archive came in contracted. The human sequence is unpacking it. The apparent paradox of advanced markers in a first incarnation soul resolves when the seed state concept is included in the framework. The tablets say this redeployment is not random. Seed state souls redeploy into historical periods where the sequence requires their archive in the incoming phase rather than at the culminating phase. A period that is beginning a new cycle after a reset needs late-stage archive at the early positions. The first stage and second stage souls of the post-reset generation need, in that early period, to have access to the bearer's and translucent's presence, even as they are in the early stages of their own archive formation. The seed state soul, redeploying into a first or second human incarnation in the early post-reset period, provides exactly this. It carries the full transmission in a form that is accessible to the early stage souls of the new cycle, even though it is presenting in what appears to be an early stage numerically. The tablets also describe what they call the deliberate seeding, a specific process in which the Anunnaki Council identified seed state souls and worked with them to calibrate their redeployment into the human sequence at particular historical moments. This passage is the most contested in the entire classification corpus because it implies an Anunnaki capacity for deliberate intervention in the incarnational process that the Council's documented debates suggest they found. Philosophically troubling even as they apparently exercised it. Enlil's faction opposed the deliberate seeding on grounds that the tablets record with some detail. His argument was that the incarnational sequence is a self-organizing system that produces better outcomes when left to develop without external optimization. Deliberate seeding introduces the optimization errors of the optimizer. The Council's understanding of which historical moments need, which types of archive, is limited by the Council's own archive, which is extensive but not complete. An optimization error at the seeding stage produces cascade effects that compound across the subsequent generational sequence and may ultimately produce worse outcomes than the unoptimized natural distribution would have. Enlil was applying in the Sumerian context, what modern systems thinkers would recognize as the caution against interventions in complex adaptive systems from outside the system's own organizing logic. Enki's counterargument is not preserved in as much detail as Enlil's in the existing fragments. The passages that would contain it are damaged. What survives is the conclusion that the deliberate seeding did occur, that it was documented, and that Enki considered it justified, not on the grounds that the optimization errors were avoidable, but on the grounds that the alternative, leaving the post-reset period without any late-stage archive presence, produced outcomes the Council had already observed in previous cycles that were worse than the optimization errors of deliberate seeding. He appears to have argued from documented precedent rather than from principle, which is consistent with his general approach in the Council records, working from the archive of observed outcomes rather than from abstract principles that the archive might contradict. The implications of the deliberate seeding for the soul classification system's practical application in the current period are significant. If the pre-reset period is characterized by anomalous clustering of late-stage souls as the tablets predict, and if the deliberate seeding contributes to this clustering, then the souls in the current period who find themselves carrying late-stage archive in circumstances that make the weight feel disproportionate are not experiencing a malfunction. They are experiencing the calibration. They were seeded for this specific historical moment with specific archive requirements. The weight is appropriate to the function. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the function is operating. This is not a comforting thought in the usual sense. But the tablets do not present it as comfort. They present it as orientation. The difference between comfort and orientation is that comfort reduces the weight. Orientation makes the weight legible. The soul that understands why it is carrying what it is carrying is not carrying less. It is carrying with more precision. The precision matters because the transmission is fragile in the way that anything dense and important is fragile when handled without understanding. The precision reduces the loss rate. The orientation, even when it is uncomfortable, is the appropriate response to the current conditions. Now let us turn to the question of how the classification maps to the concept the tablets call the recognition community. Because Enki's system was not designed to be used by isolated individuals, it was designed to be used by communities organized around the framework. And the tablets describe specific properties of what a functioning recognition community produces that isolated individual use cannot replicate. The most important property is what the tablets call distributed archive access. Individual souls in the sequence have access to their own archive only. The deeper the archive, the more is accessible, but no individual soul can access the archives of other souls directly. A recognition community, however, organized around the classification system, functions as what the tablets describe as a collective archive repository. Not because the individual archives merge, they do not, but because when souls at different stages of the sequence are in genuine contact, they provide each other with access to what the tablets call archive shadow. The second stage soul in genuine contact with a sixth stage soul does not gain the sixth stage's archive, but it gains something like the shadow of it, the felt sense of what the sixth stage's temporal depth produces in encounter. And the shadow is different from nothing. The shadow changes the second stage's processing of its own experience, slightly, but consistently. Over time, the archive shadow effect compounds. This is why Enki argued to the Council that soul classification communities were the appropriate vehicle for transmission preservation rather than physical institutional archives. The community carries transmission not through formal record but through the archive shadow effect that genuine cross-stage contact produces. Each stage's presence in genuine contact with the others produces something in the others that the formal transmission cannot replicate. The transmission is not just information, it is felt orientation. And felt orientation is transmitted by field, not by text. The community generates the field transmits the orientation deepens the archive. The deepened archive generates a field of greater range and depth. The cycle is self-reinforcing in exactly the way that institutional preservation is not. The tablets describe historical recognition communities that operated under various institutional covers across the period from the Eridu founding through the later Mesopotamian period. The most explicitly documented is the Eridu temple community itself, whose administrative records in the Nippur collection show the soul classification framework in active organizational use. But the tablets also describe less formal communities, organized around craft traditions and narrative transmission practices, that carried the framework without the formal administrative structure. The craft traditions the tablets describe as recognition community carriers are specific enough to be identified with known historical phenomena. The tablet language for a community of practitioners who transmit the felt content of the soul classification system through a shared skill practice rather than through explicit teaching is the same language used to describe what later became the guild tradition in the ancient Near East. Not all guilds. The tablets are careful about this. Craft traditions can be purely skill transmission communities without the soul classification framework. But certain craft traditions, identified by specific initiation structures and by the particular type of interstage relationship they maintained between master and apprentice, were functioning as recognition communities, in exactly the sense Enki described. The master-apprentice relationship in these communities was not simply skill transmission. It was, in the tablet's language, a deliberate cross-stage encounter structured to maximize the archive shadow effect. The master was not selected for the apprentice purely on the basis of having the most advanced technical skills. The selection criteria included soul stage, specifically the presence of a 6th or 7th stage soul, whose archive shadow could influence the 3rd or 4th stage apprentice's archive formation in the specific ways the classification prescribes. The skill transmission was real. The technical knowledge was genuinely passed. But the guild structure existed at its deepest level as an institutional vehicle for the cross-stage encounters that the recognition community requires. This explains a phenomenon that historians of craft traditions have noticed without being able to account for within the conventional analysis. Certain craft lineages produced successive generations of practitioners whose quality of work reflected something beyond the technical skills that could be explicitly transmitted. The skills themselves could be documented and taught. But the work produced by these lineages had a quality that the documented skills did not fully explain. The tablets say the unexplained quality is the archive shadow effect compounding across generations. The transmission of the felt orientation, not just the technical knowledge, deepens the archive of the receiving soul in ways that subsequently influence the quality of everything that archive touches, including the craft work produced from within that archive. The tablets identify specific craft traditions in the Sumerian and later Mesopotamian record as carrying the recognition community framework. The scribal tradition that produced the cuneiform tablets themselves is described in a section of the classification text as a recognition community in exactly this sense. The selection of scribes for temple service was not purely technical. The assessment of their soul stage was built into the training period. The scribes who produced the highest fidelity copies of transmission-critical texts were specifically selected from those assessed to be in the 5th, 6th, or 7th stage. Their archive thinness as copyists, their ability to transmit the text without substantially altering it with their own interpretive layer, was the specific quality the recognition community needed for exactly that function. This suggests that the transmission-critical Sumerian texts that have survived, including the fragments of the soul classification system itself, were copied by scribes, whose soul stage selection was specifically intended to maximize transmission fidelity. The texts we have may be more intact than they would otherwise be, precisely because the people who copied them were chosen for the quality of carrying without coloring. The archive shadow effect means that even the physical transmission of the tablets was embedded in the recognition community framework. Now, let us turn to the practical question that many listeners will have been holding through this entire presentation. The question of what to do with this framework, not what to believe about it. Not whether it is literally true in a way that can be verified by conventional archaeological scholarship. The practical question, given the soul classification system's description of where the current historical period is in the long sequence, and given the classification's prescription for each stage's function in a pre-reset period, what does a soul in the current period actually do with this? The tablets address this question directly. They do not leave it as an implication. Enki's council presentations consistently move from classification to practical prescription, and the prescription for souls in a pre-reset period is the most specific content in the entire record. For the soul in the 1st or 2nd stage, the prescription is simple, and the tablets offer it without condescension. Live genuinely. Do not protect yourself from consequence in a way that delays the archive formation. The current period's compressed conditions will write the archive faster than ordinary periods. Trust the writing. Do not attempt to manage the speed or intensity of the archive formation process by avoiding the experiences that drive it. The current period is not a mistake, and the archive being written in it is not corrupted by the intensity of the conditions. The intensity is the point. For the soul in the 3rd or 4th stage, the prescription requires more context. The first builder and the turning soul in the current period are in the position of constructing frameworks in a moment when the dominant frameworks are visibly failing. The temptation the tablets identify as most dangerous for these stages in the current period is the reconstruction error. Taking the failing dominant frameworks and rebuilding them with slightly different surface features while preserving the underlying structure that produced the failure. The tablets prescribe what they call the longer reach. The third and fourth stage soul-building frameworks in the current period should reach further into the sequence than its own stage can naturally see, specifically by putting itself in sustained, genuine contact with souls at the later stages and receiving the archive shadow of what the later stages carry. The framework built with that shadow present will be more useful to the next cycle than the framework built from within the third or fourth stage's natural horizon alone. For the soul, in the fifth stage, the tablets prescribe what they have already prescribed for this stage in any period, the descent practice, but they frame it differently for the pre-reset period. They say, the hollowing you are in is not incidental. It is the pre-reset period's most important single function. A soul entering the hollowing now, in this historical moment, with this density of late-stage archive in the surrounding population, has access to archive shadow of a quality and quantity that the fifth stage in ordinary historical periods does not. The descent practice has, in this period, unusual support. The field is rich with late-stage presence. Use it deliberately. The integration that your stage is working toward will arrive faster and will be more complete when the field conditions support it. The pre-reset clustering of late-stage souls is not an accident. It is the field being prepared for the fifth stage's accelerated integration. For the soul in the sixth and seventh stage, the tablet's prescription for the current period is the most demanding, in the quietest possible way. Not demanding in the sense of requiring dramatic action. Demanding in the sense of requiring sustained presence under conditions that make sustained presence difficult. The bearer and the translucent soul in the pre-reset period are operating in what the tablets call the field of maximum noise. The signal-to-noise ratio problem that Enki identified as a pre-reset marker is not an abstract systemic feature. It is the daily operational environment of the late-stage soul in this period. Every day, the noise increases. Every day, the surface symbol proliferation adds more to the environment that the late-stage soul must hold without being either overwhelmed by or contemptuous of. The load-bearing capacity the sixth stage, developed across its prior crossings, is being called on not for a single dramatic event, but for a sustained background labor that is invisible precisely because it is doing its job. The tablets use a specific image for this function that appears in a slightly different form in several other ancient traditions, which suggests it is part of the core transmission that survived across multiple cultural vehicles. The image is of something that holds weight not by growing stronger under the weight, which is the popular model of how endurance works, but by becoming more accurately calibrated to the weight's actual distribution. The sixth and seventh stage soul's function in the pre-reset period is not heroic in the conventional sense. It is the work of accurate calibration, of knowing the weight's actual shape well enough to carry it without the cumulative distortion that inaccurate distribution produces over time. The heroic carry looks effortful and dramatic. The calibrated carry looks ordinary, almost nothing. The tablets say this is why it works when the dramatic carry eventually fails. The dramatic carry depletes. The calibrated carry is sustainable across the full duration of what the current period requires. The tablets describe a specific quality of the sixth and seventh stage soul in the current period that they call the visible absence. The late stage soul functioning correctly in a pre-reset period is, in a paradoxical sense, most present where it is least noticed. Not because it is hiding, because its characteristic quality, the bearer's genuine patience, and the translucent soul's non-defensive presence, does not register as the kind of significant presence that the current culture's reversal of authority dynamic is conditioned to notice. The display capacity-based authority system notices the soul with the widest signal. The late-stage soul's signal is not wide, it is deep. And in a culture oriented toward width, depth is a kind of invisibility. The tablets say this is not a failure of the system. It is the system functioning under difficult conditions. The transmission moves through the depth, even when the surface culture cannot see it. The eighth stage soul's prescription in the current period returns us to the tablet's most characteristic statement about the complete soul. No prescription, or, more precisely, a prescription that cannot be separated from what the soul already is. The eighth stage soul in the current period is the seed state adjacent. It is the compressed archive at the threshold of its own completion. What it does is what it is. The tablets leave this as the final statement for the eighth stage in every context where the stage is addressed. The prescription and the nature have converged. There is no gap between them for instruction to fit into. Now let us return to something the tablets address near the end of the classification system's prescriptive section that has not yet been examined here. The question of recognition between souls in the current period and whether the recognition sense can be deliberately cultivated rather than simply waited for. The tablets say it can be cultivated, not quickly and not through any shortcut that bypasses the genuine archive formation requirement, but deliberately and with consistent practice. The recognition sense can be made more reliable and more nuanced. The cultivation method the tablets describe is not meditation in the generic sense. It is a specific practice that works directly with the recognition sense's natural channel. The practice begins with what the tablets call the encounter audit. After any significant encounter with another person, not immediately, but at the end of the day or after a period of settled time has passed, the soul returns to the first seconds of the encounter and tries to recover what the recognition sense registered before the analytical mind arrived. Not what you thought about the person, what arrived in the body before the thought. The tablets say the analytical mind tends to move so quickly that it covers the recognition sense's initial signal within the first second or two of any encounter. The encounter audit is the practice of going back to the moment before the analytical mind arrived and recovering whatever was there. Over time, the tablets say, this practice produces two things. First, the recovery becomes faster. The soul becomes more accustomed to noticing the recognition sense's initial signal in real time rather than only in retrospect. Second, the signal becomes more nuanced. The quality differences between first-stage freshness and eighth-stage completion, which look similar on the surface, begin to become distinguishable. The specific quality of each stage's presence, which the tablets describe as an accurate recognition instrument, becomes an instrument the soul can actually use rather than one it can only read about. The tablets also describe what they call the story audit, a practice specifically for cultivating recognition of the cross-tradition transmission embedding that Enki described as the vehicle for wider distribution of the soul classification system. The story audit involves returning to the narratives that have moved you most strongly in your life, the ones that produce the strongest quality of recognition, sense response, and asking a specific question about them, not what the story means thematically. What stage of the classification sequence each major character is in, and what transition the story is describing in the soul classification framework. The tablets say the stories that produce the strongest recognition sense response are the ones most densely encoded with the transmission. And the encoding, when you can see it, reveals something about where your own archive is and what the recognition is responding to. This practice is not interpretation in the literary analysis sense. It is recognition archaeology. The story moves you because something in your archive recognizes something in the story's encoding. Finding what that something is gives you information about your archive's current depth and orientation. The tablets say Enki used this practice with the Eridu initiates, who were having difficulty locating themselves on the sequence through the more direct marker-based assessment. The stories they responded to most strongly were more reliable indicators of their actual stage than their answers to direct assessment questions, because the recognition sense bypasses the analytical mind's self-presentation layer in a way that direct questioning cannot. The tablets conclude the soul classification system's technical section with what Enki called the single most important instruction in the entire framework. It comes after all the stage descriptions, all the transition markers, all the practical prescriptions, all the historical context and cross-tradition correlation. It is short enough to fit in a single tablet entry. And the scribes marked it with a notation that appears in the Sumerian administrative tradition to indicate content that is considered both primary and non-negotiable. Something that must not be lost, must not be altered, and must be transmitted as close to verbatim as the medium allows. The instruction is this: do not tell a soul what stage it is in before the soul can hear it. The tablets spend more time explaining this instruction than any other single passage in the classification, because the instruction appears counterintuitive. If the classification is a recognition tool, why withhold the recognition from someone who has not yet developed the capacity to receive it? Would it not accelerate the development to tell the soul where it is in the sequence? Enki's answer, documented at unusual length, is no, and the reason is not arbitrary. The archive formation that produces genuine stage transition does not happen through conceptual information about where you are in the sequence. It happens through genuine experience of the type that each stage requires. Telling a second stage soul that it is in the second stage and explaining what the third stage looks like does not move the soul toward the third stage. It gives the soul's analytical mind a concept about the third stage to add to its collection. The concept sits on top of the second stage's wound archive without changing it. The soul now knows about the third stage. It has not moved toward the third stage. And in a certain type of analytical soul, the knowledge about the third stage can actually delay the genuine transition by providing the satisfaction of knowing without the requirement of experiencing. This is what the tablets call the map, without the territory problem applied to the soul classification system itself. The system is a map. The territory is the genuine experiential sequence. If the map is given too early, it substitutes for the territory in the same way that all false maps do. The soul navigates the map rather than the territory. It develops expertise in the classification system's descriptions rather than genuine archive depth in the stages the descriptions are describing. And it may never notice the substitution has occurred because the descriptions are accurate enough that the conceptual navigation feels like genuine movement. The instruction "do not tell a soul what stage it is in before the soul can hear it" is therefore not a withholding of kindness. It is the preservation of the condition for genuine archive formation. The soul that arrives at the recognition of its own stage through the genuine experience of that stage's markers, through living through the transitions and the distortions and the practices, carries an archive that the soul told its stage by someone else does not. The recognition from inside the experience is the archive. The information delivered from outside the experience is a concept about the archive. They are not the same thing. And only the archive, not the concept, moves the soul through the sequence. This is why the tablets say the classification system is most useful, not as something to learn about and immediately apply to everyone around you, but as something to return to at intervals as your own experience deepens. The descriptions that produced one quality of recognition at 30 will produce a different quality of recognition at 50. Not because you have moved through the sequence faster than is realistic, because the archive has deepened enough in the intervening period to receive a layer of the description that was not yet accessible at 30. The transmission is patient. You return to it as you develop the archive to receive its next layer. With this instruction understood, let us now look at the 8 stages one final time, not as descriptions to be memorized and applied, as a complete picture of a single journey, the journey every soul in the sequence has been on and is still on, seen all at once, as a whole, rather than as separate positions. The journey begins at a surface, completely open, completely present, completely in the immediate moment. No weight from what has come before, because nothing has yet come before. The surface receives the first marks. The marks accumulate. They begin to form the outline of a wound. The wound becomes the organizing principle of a self. The self begins to build outward from the wound. It builds with intelligence. It discovers leverage. It builds structures. The structures are elegant. They work. Then something arrives that the structures cannot account for. The soul discovers that the structures are not the territory. The discovery is devastating in proportion to how completely the soul had identified with the structures. The soul enters the false map cycle. It trades one certainty for another until it has been through enough maps to begin to sit in the territory itself. The territory reveals something the maps could not show. The framework itself is a framework. The soul begins to dissolve. Something opens. Something large enters the opening. The soul does not have the capacity yet to carry what has entered. It builds the capacity, slowly, across more crossings than any single lifetime can contain. The capacity develops. The soul becomes able to carry. The carrying develops a specific quality of thinning. The interpretive layer thins. The signal passes through with increasing fidelity. The soul arrives at a place where the interpretation and the thing itself have come so close together that the distance between them is no longer the primary fact of perception. The full archive is accessible. The full experiential range of the sequence is available. The soul has been all 8 of these things. It knows all 8 from inside. The knowing is complete, and the completion contracts into a seed, and the seed is placed, with deliberate calibration, into the next moment that requires what it contains. This is the journey the tablets describe. This is the sequence. This is what the 8 Sumerian soul ages map when you see them not as static categories, but as the moving picture they are. Let us now examine what the tablets say about the fate of the soul classification system itself. Because the system as Enki designed it was intended to survive. Not in a vault, not in a formal institutional archive. In the way he prescribed for all transmission of this type. In the souls who received it and carried it. The council record documents the period after Enki's initial presentation of the classification system when the question of its preservation was debated. The debate took a form that is remarkable in its prescience about how the system would actually be transmitted. Enlil's faction argued for inscription on permanent tablets sealed in the most stable temple chambers at Eridu, with access restricted to the trained priesthood and with strict protocols for controlled transmission to vetted initiates. This is the institutional preservation strategy, applied to the soul classification system specifically. Enki's counterproposal was what the tablets describe as wide seeding, encoding the core recognition content of the system into the narrative traditions that the broader population already carried, making it impossible to lose because it was not in any single location. The debate outcome is ambiguous in the fragments. The tablets record that both approaches were implemented. The formal inscription did occur. The Nippur administrative records suggest the temple priesthood at Eridu operated with the formal classification system in active use for several hundred years. The narrative seeding also occurred. The hero journey, encoding that appears across multiple ancient traditions, is, in the tablets' claim, part of Enki's deliberate distribution strategy. What actually happened to the formal inscription is the story of everything that happens to formal institutional archives. The Eridu temple community eventually was disrupted, not by a global reset of the kind the tablets predict for the current period, by the ordinary disruptions of Mesopotamian history, conquest, climate, political realignment. The institution was absorbed and then lost. The tablets were scattered, the trained priesthood was dispersed, the administrative framework disappeared from active use. What happened to the narrative seeding is a different story. The hero journey encoding persisted. It moved through cultures that had no formal connection to Eridu and no awareness that they were carrying a transmission that had been deliberately structured. The Norse Odin, who hangs on the world tree and descends and returns with wisdom, is the fifth stage and sixth stage transition in the soul classification framework. The Egyptian Osiris, who is dismembered and reconstructed, is the same sequence at the mythological register. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl narratives, the Vedic Indra myths, the shamanic traditions across Siberia and the Americas that describe the healer's initiatory dismemberment and reconstruction, all carrying the same structural encoding. The story survived because Enki was right about stories surviving what formal records do not. But the story carries the transmission at the surface level that Enki designed for wide distribution. The deeper technical classification, the stage markers and assessment protocols and community practices, is in the formal record. And the formal record is in fragments. The Nippur collection. The Eridu excavations. The damaged and disputed fragments that scholars have been working to piece together since the first Mesopotamian excavations in the 19th century. The complete system has not survived intact. What has survived is enough to reconstruct the outline, not all the detail, enough to recognize the framework and its implications. This is significant for the current period specifically, because the pre-reset period is the period when the transmission most needs to be in circulation, and the current state of the transmission is that it is in partial recovery. Scholars are working with fragments. The fragments are coming together faster than they were 50 years ago. The connections between the fragments and the parallel traditions in other cultures are being recognized more explicitly than they were before. The picture is assembling, incompletely, but the direction is toward greater completeness rather than greater fragmentation. The tablets say this is also part of the system functioning. The transmission does not return to full circulation all at once. It returns in stages, in correspondence with the development of the archive in the population to receive it. As the archive deepens across the pre-reset period, the transmission's recovery correspondingly deepens. The souls developing the archive depth to receive the transmission's deeper layers are, in the pre-reset period, doing so in correspondence with the fragments that are being recovered and assembled. The recovery and the development are synchronized. Not perfectly, not without error and loss, but in the general direction that the tablets describe as the system's characteristic behavior in the period before a disruption that it was designed to survive. What this means for the soul using the classification system in the current period is something the tablets address with what has become, in the surviving record, their closing instruction. Not the last instruction chronologically. The one the scribes marked as the summation of the practical prescriptions across the entire system. The instruction is directed at every soul, regardless of its current stage. It says, "The knowing is not for you alone." The tablets expand this into several sentences in the original, but the expansion is less important than the six-word core. The knowing is not for you alone. This is the instruction that the second stage soul needs when the recognition event produces the grandeur error that reads its wound archive as evidence of unique personal significance. The knowing is not for you alone. This is the instruction that the fourth stage soul needs when it trades the false map for a new certainty that it mistakes for awakening. The knowing is not for you alone. This is the instruction that the seventh stage soul needs when its comfort with being unrecognized tips toward the isolation that the opacity restoration practice is meant to correct. Whatever is in the archive, the tablets say, is in the archive for the purpose of being carried and transmitted to the archive's next appropriate recipient. The archive is the individual soul's, in the sense that it was built from the individual soul's experiences. But it is not the individual soul's in the sense of being for the individual soul's exclusive use. The grooves were made by specific instruments in specific crossings. The writing on the tablet is uniquely configured in each soul. But the tablet is a transmission medium. The writing on it is meant to be read, and read by the next generation of souls that the current generation's archive can reach. The distribution problem Enki identified is not solved by the classification system existing. It is solved by souls who have encountered the classification system doing what the seventh stage does naturally, carrying the transmission with minimal alteration toward the next available recipient. The next recipient is not always obvious. Sometimes it is someone in close proximity. Sometimes it is someone the carrying soul will never meet in person. The transmission can move through the artifact of a conversation, of a piece of writing, of a story told in the particular way that the narrative seeding strategy encodes. It can move through what the tablets call the field effect of a soul carrying the archive in daily life without announcing the archive, without performing the carrying, simply being in the world with the depth that the sequence has built and allowing the archive shadow of that depth to reach the souls in the surrounding field. This is the most ordinary form of the transmission's continuation, not the dramatic intervention, not the heroic act, the daily presence of souls with genuine archive depth in ordinary human contexts. Teaching, making things, raising children, building relationships, living in communities, doing the work that the day requires, carrying the archive in all of it, not announcing the archive, not performing the depth, just being the depth, and allowing whatever the depth touches to be touched by it. The tablets have a final passage that Enki addressed specifically to what the council records call the Last Watcher. This phrase is unusual enough in the Sumerian tradition that it requires some attention. In the Sumerian and later Enochic traditions, the Watchers are the Anunnaki observers. The Last Watcher is typically interpreted as the final Anunnaki presence in the period of active observation of human development. But in the soul classification context, the phrase has a different implication. The tablets use Last Watcher to refer to something in the 8th stage soul itself, the part of the archive that does not fully re-enter any single stage but observes the full sequence from a position that is simultaneously within it and adjacent to it. The capacity, in other words, for the complete soul to hold the entire sequence in view without being captured by any single stage's characteristic orientation. Enki's final recorded words in the soul classification section of the council transcripts are addressed to this Last Watcher in every soul, to the part of the archive that is not fully in any single stage but can feel the whole. He said, "You have been all of this. You are in the process of completing all of this. And when the completion contracts into the seed carries all of what you have been, every stage, every crossing, every archive writing experience, every grief and every discovery and every descent and every bearing. All of it in the compressed form that allows it to be carried through whatever the next period requires," he said. The seed is not the end, it is the mechanism. The mechanism by which what has been built across one cycle becomes the foundation of what is built in the next. The tree is temporary. The seed is the tree's continuity. You are not building something that will last. You are building something that will be carried. And the carrying is the point. The tablets record that the council did not respond to this final statement. The silence that followed it lasted long enough for the scribes to note it explicitly in the record, which was unusual for council proceedings. And then, the session ended without formal resolution on the points that had been debated. The soul classification system was neither formally adopted by the council as policy nor formally rejected. It was simply placed in the record, available, for the soul with enough archive to receive it. And here we are, with the record, available. Now let us take the complete picture of the 8 stages and examine what they look like as a practical map for someone trying to locate themselves in the current moment. Not in the distant past of Eridu, not in the abstract framework of a classification system. In the actual experience of a soul alive in the current period, trying to understand what it is carrying and why the weight feels the way it does. The first thing the tablets ask you to consider is not which stage you are in. That comes second. The first thing is simpler. Have you been here before? Not to this video. Not to this framework. To this quality of weight, the feeling that something important is at stake and you do not quite have the language for what it is or what your role in it might be. The tablets say this feeling is not anxiety in the ordinary sense. Anxiety is the second stage's response to threat. This is different. This is the feeling that the archive has been here before and is trying to orient you to the current situation using the orientation it has developed across prior crossings. The disorientation you may feel is not pathological. It is the mismatch between the current situation's novel features and the archive's attempt to apply prior crossings orientation to something that is familiar in structure, but different in specifics. If that description landed somewhere specific in you, the tablets say that specificity is data, not proof of anything. Data about the archive's current depth and what it is working with. If you found yourself resonating most strongly with the unscribed soul's description, the quality of fresh collision and high sensory presence without accumulated interpretive weight, you are likely early in the sequence, not in any pejorative sense. In the sense of the unscribed surface receiving its first marks, the archive is forming. The formation is the point, the tablets say. Receive what is coming to you with full engagement. Do not protect yourself from the consequence that is trying to write the archive. If you found yourself resonating most strongly with the newly marked soul's description, the wound as organizing principle, the relational intensity, the simultaneous pull of idealized past, an unbearable present, and terrifying future, you are in the stage of deepest archive writing, the tablets say. The wound is the instrument, not the conclusion. What is being written on it is real and will be readable for the rest of the sequence. Do not try to resolve the wound faster than the genuine experience of it allows. The resolution is in the depth of the writing, not in the speed of its completion. If you found yourself resonating with the first builder's description, the discovery of leverage, the building reflex, the efficiency that can become the efficiency trap, you are in the stage of first genuine agency. The tablets say, build. Build for the person who is not in the room. Let the building be deliberate in the direction of the seventh stage's communication fidelity, even if you cannot yet fully access that fidelity. The reach toward it from the third stage is itself the practice. If you found yourself resonating with the turning soul, the discovery of the false map, the compensatory certainty loop, the specific vertigo of learning that what you thought was foundation was actually a framework constructed over no particular foundation, you are in the most productive stage of framework dissolution, the tablets say. Sit in the territory, not because the discomfort is virtuous, because the territory will teach you the things the maps cannot. The time you spend in genuine not knowing in the fourth stage is the most efficient archive deepening you will do in this lifetime. If you found yourself resonating with the hollowed soul, the dissolution of familiar adequacy, the non-sequential memory access, the source knowledge that arrives without explanation, the specific quality of the opening that the hollowing produces, you are in the stage that requires the most precision of practice. The tablets say, descend deliberately. The capacity you are building to carry what the hollowing has opened will serve the sequence in ways that are not yet visible from inside the fifth stage. The descent practice is not optional at this stage. It is the point. If you found yourself resonating with the bearer, the temporal depth, the dissolution of contempt for early stages, the acceptance of the long rhythm, the specific loneliness of being able to see the whole arc while being present to the immediate detail, you are carrying more than most people around you can see. The tablets say, maintain the genuine presence, not the performance of it, the genuine contact with what is actually here, in this person, in this moment, without collapsing into the horizon gaze. The immediate is not a distraction from the long view. It is where the long view arrives. If you found yourself resonating with the translucent soul, the absence of personal agenda in perception, the transmission fidelity, the comfort with being unrecognized, the specific quality of thinness that makes signal carrying possible, you are in the position the current period most specifically requires, the tablets say. Carry. You know what you are carrying. You do not need the carrier to be visible. The transmission does not require your visibility. It requires your fidelity. Those are different things. One is for you. The other is for the sequence. If you found yourself resonating with the complete soul, and the tablets say this resonance is rare, not because the stage is unattainable, but because its signature most closely resembles the first stage's signature, and the two are frequently confused, you are at the threshold of the contraction. The tablets say nothing further that is prescription. They simply say, the forest needs the old growth and the sapling. Both are necessary. The old growth does not explain itself to the sapling. It simply is what it is. And the sapling grows in the specific field conditions that the old growth creates. Conditions the sapling cannot see or name, but that are demonstrably affecting its development. Be what you are. That is the entire prescription. Let us return, at the end of this presentation, to the question with which the tablets themselves end the classification system. The question Enki asked the council after the final silence that followed his last statement. He asked them, "What does the record show?" The record, he told them, shows the following. Every time a disruption has occurred in the long timeline that the Anunnaki Council has observed, the question of what was carried through it was determined not by what was preserved institutionally, but by what was embedded in souls of sufficient archive depth to survive the disruption with the transmission intact. Every time the transmission was embedded only in institutions, the institutions were disrupted with the civilization that produced them, and what was reconstructed on the other side was built from shallower archive than was available before the disruption. Every time the transmission was embedded in soul-level archive, the archive survived the disruption in whatever souls carried it through, and the reconstruction on the other side had access to the deeper material. The record was clear about this. The council could look at it themselves. The evidence was in the comparative analysis of what each cycle's reconstruction period had access to versus what the preceding civilization-level development had achieved. The difference, cycle by cycle, was precisely accounted for by the depth of the soul-embedded archive that survived each disruption. Nothing more, nothing less. He then said, "The current period's record is being written now, by every soul in the sequence that is choosing, in this specific historical moment, what to do with what it is carrying. The record is not predetermined. The distribution of soul stages in the current period, the clustering of late-stage archive in what the classification identifies as the pre-reset configuration, is not a guarantee of any particular outcome. It is a condition. The condition is favorable, more favorable than several previous cycles that entered their transition period with lower late-stage density. But favorable conditions do not produce outcomes automatically. They produce the possibility of outcomes. The outcomes are produced by the choices made within the conditions. The choices the tablets describe are not dramatic in the conventional sense. They are the daily choices of what to do with the archive. Whether to use it for personal navigation only or to allow it to function as the transmission medium, it is also capable of being. Whether to build structures for the elegance of the building or for the user who was not in the room. Whether to sit in the territory long enough to learn its actual shape or to move quickly to the next certainty because the territory's openness is uncomfortable. Whether to carry the transmission with the fidelity that the sequence requires or to color it with the archive's own interpretive layer and call the coloring fidelity. These are small choices. They do not look significant in the moment. They look like the ordinary decisions of a day. Whether to speak or stay quiet, whether to engage genuinely or perform engagement. Whether to let the encounter actually land or to process it through the archive's existing framework before it can produce anything new. Whether to be present to exactly where you are in the sequence or to pretend, for the comfort of the pretense, to be further along. The tablets say the small choices compound, not dramatically, in the way that all compounding works, invisibly at first, and then in a way that is difficult to reverse. The soul that consistently chooses the small choice toward genuine archive formation deepens its archive in ways that become visible over time, not in a single choice or a single period, across the arc of a lifetime and then across the arc of multiple lifetimes. The soul that consistently chooses the small choice toward comfort and performance rather than genuine formation produces an archive that is broader but shallower than its stage indicators would predict. The indicators can be faked. The archive cannot. The archive is the record of what actually happened, not the record of what was claimed to have happened. The classification system is therefore not a measure of achievement. It is a map of what is actually in the archive. And the archive contains what it contains because of what the soul actually went through, not because of what the soul learned about going through things. The distinction is the entire difference between genuine stage development and the counterfeit transmission that Enki identified as the most dangerous misapplication of the system. The Sumerian tradition's ultimate claim about the 8 soul ages is simple enough to state, complex enough to take a lifetime to genuinely receive, and deep enough that each lifetime's reception reveals another layer of what it means. The claim is this: you have been all of these things. You are in the process of having been all of these things. And the process of having been all of these things is the only vehicle through which the transmission that makes the next cycle possible can be carried. The process is not comfortable. The tablets do not promise it will be. The second stage's wound writing is not comfortable. The fourth stage's false map dissolution is not comfortable. The fifth stage's hollowing is not comfortable. The sixth stage's sustained presence under maximum noise conditions is not comfortable. The seventh stage's comfort with being unrecognized, which is genuinely developed rather than performed, requires the prior discomfort of all the stages that make it possible. What the tablets promise instead of comfort is something the soul at any stage, with sufficient archive to receive it, will recognize as more valuable than comfort. The tablets call it the felt sense of the sequence, the direct, non-conceptual experience of being exactly where you are in a sequence that is real, that has been traversed by souls before you, that is being traversed by souls around you, and that has a direction. Not a direction toward a destination that can be reached and then rested in. A direction that is the sequence's own continuing movement, which does not stop when any particular stage is completed, which does not stop when the 8th stage contracts into the seed, which does not stop when the seed redeploys into the next historical moment that requires what it contains. The movement is the point. The sequence is the point. The carrying is the point. And the fact that you are here, receiving this, wherever you are in the 8 stages, means the archive in you is deep enough to hear at least part of what the tablets are saying. The part you can hear now is for now. The part you cannot yet hear is waiting for the archive to catch up to it. The tablets will still be here. The transmission is patient. Enki's council record ends with a passage that the scribes marked as the final entry in the soul classification series. It is not a formal conclusion. It reads more like a note. The kind of note that someone makes when they have said what they came to say and are leaving the room. It says, "The ones who need this will find it, and when they do, they will know they were looking for it before they knew they were looking." The scribes added nothing after this. The classification record ends there. The tablets were sealed, scattered, and eventually buried. They waited. For 3,000 years they waited, and they are being read now by souls whose archives are deep enough, in this specific historical moment, to receive what was placed in them. That is not a coincidence. That is the system functioning. There is one more passage in the tablets that has not been addressed here, and it is the one that the classification system's practical application most depends on. It is the passage that addresses what the tablets call the threshold recognition. Not the recognition of which stage you are in, the recognition of the threshold moment, the specific window in which the transition from one stage to the next is actively possible, and in which the soul has maximum agency over whether the transition occurs or is deferred. The tablets say the threshold moment does not announce itself. It does not arrive with signals that the analytical mind can easily read. It arrives, according to the scribes, as a quality of pressure that has a different character than the ordinary pressure of a demanding situation. Ordinary pressure pushes from outside. The threshold pressure, the tablets say, has a quality of surfacing from inside, as if something in the archive itself is pushing toward the next layer, rather than being pushed by external circumstance toward it. The soul in the threshold moment often does not identify it as a threshold until it has passed. Looking back, the period immediately before a genuine stage transition is frequently described by souls who have moved through it as a time when things felt unusually pressured from an unusual direction, when the quality of difficulty was different from difficulty in the ordinary sense, more internal, more fundamental, less like a problem to be solved and more like a structure to be passed through. The tablets say the threshold recognition can be developed, like the recognition sense itself, through practice. The specific practice for threshold recognition is what they call the pressure audit. Periodically, not in crisis but in settled reflective time, the soul considers the quality of the pressure it is currently under, not the content of the pressure, not what the pressure is about or what produced it. The quality. Is it external? Is it coming from circumstances that require response? Or is it internal? Is there a quality of something that wants to be different? Not because the circumstances demand it, but because the archive itself is reaching toward its next layer? The tablets say the internal pressure, the archive reaching toward the next layer quality, is the threshold signal. Not a guarantee that the transition is imminent. Not a prescription for dramatic action in response to the signal. Simply an indicator. Something in the archive is ready to go further. Whether the going further happens in this lifetime or a subsequent one depends on many factors, including what experiences are available in the current period, what the soul's archive formation rate is, given the current conditions, and what the sequence requires from this particular soul's archive in the current historical moment. The threshold recognition does not force the transition. It identifies the window. The window can be used or not. Both have consequences for the sequence. Neither is categorically wrong. The tablets decline to prescribe what the soul must do with a recognized threshold. They only say, recognize it when it is there. Do not mistake it for ordinary pressure. And do not mistake ordinary pressure for it. This caution about the distinction between ordinary and threshold pressure is one of the most practically important passages in the entire classification because it addresses a specific error pattern that the tablets say is common in the current period. The pre-reset conditions produce unusually high ordinary pressure. Many souls in the current period are under external pressure that is genuinely significant and genuinely demanding, and that pressure can be misread as the threshold signal, producing the response that a genuine threshold would warrant: the descent practice, the territory residency, the witness cultivation, applied to what is actually ordinary circumstance pressure, rather than archive reaching toward the next layer pressure. The misapplication produces a specific type of depletion. The soul uses the threshold response energy on the ordinary pressure event and then does not have the resource available when the actual threshold arrives. The tablets prescribe discernment as the corrective, not passive discernment, active discernment. The deliberate practice of distinguishing the quality of pressure rather than automatically categorizing all significant pressure as threshold pressure. This practice requires enough archive depth to feel the difference between the two qualities. It cannot be described well enough to substitute for the felt distinction. But the existence of the distinction can be named, and the practice of looking for it can be recommended, which is what the tablets do. Now let us consider the full body of what has been presented here, and what the tablets are asking the current period souls to do with it. The soul classification system is not a trophy. The stages are not achievements to be claimed. The knowledge of the system is not a substitute for the genuine archive formation that produces genuine stage development. These are the tablets' repeated, emphatic cautions. They are not incidental. They are structural to the design of the system. What the system is, in Enki's design, is orientation. For the soul that is carrying more weight than it can explain, for the soul that has been through enough, that the explanatory frameworks of the culture no longer fully contain the experience. For the soul that recognizes, in the recognition sense rather than in the analytical mind, that something is at stake in the current historical moment that the ordinary language of current culture does not quite reach. The system gives this soul the vocabulary that the archive has been generating but that the culture has not provided a container for. The vocabulary is not the archive. The container is not the content. The map is not the territory. The tablets repeat these cautions because they know the risk. The recognition of a framework that names your experience is powerful enough that it can substitute for the experience if the soul allows it to. The system is most dangerous to the soul that is most hungry for the framework. The fourth stage, emerging from the false map discovery into the compensatory certainty loop, is the stage most at risk of consuming the soul classification system as its next false map, rather than using it as an orientation tool toward the genuine territory of its own archive formation. The tablet's final practical instruction to every soul, regardless of stage, beyond the stage-specific prescriptions, is this: use the map to find the territory. Then go into the territory, then return to the map when you need to reorient. Then go back into the territory. The map and the territory are not alternatives. They are in a relationship. The map serves the territory. The territory teaches the map's limits. The soul that learns to use them in this relationship is the soul that develops the archive the current period requires. The current period does require it. The tablet's description of the pre-reset configuration is precise enough to be confrontational when placed against current conditions. The proliferation of images over words, the reversal of authority toward display capacity, the severance of the vertical transmission line. These are not vague prophetic indicators. They describe observable features of the current cultural landscape with an accuracy that should give pause to anyone who has been tracking those features without having language for why they register as significant. And the tablet's prescription for what the soul does in response to this configuration is not a call to dramatic intervention. It is a call to genuine archive formation, to genuine presence in the sequence, to the daily, ordinary, unspectacular work of carrying what the archive contains toward the next appropriate recipient, in the way that the sequence has always transmitted itself, through genuine encounter, through the archive shadow that one soul's genuine depth casts in the field of the souls around it, through the small choices that compound invisibly and then visibly, through the stories that carry the felt content of the sequence in forms that survive what formal records do not. The 8 Sumerian soul ages are a map. The territory they map is your own archive. The archive is the record of everywhere you have been and everything you have metabolized across the full length of the sequence. It is yours in the sense that it is constituted by your specific crossings. It is not only yours in the sense that what is in it is available to every soul you encounter with sufficient archive to receive the shadow of it. The archive is both personal and transmitted. That is its nature. That is the nature of the sequence. That is what the tablets were designed to help you understand, so that you can carry what you are carrying with enough clarity to carry it well, and to know where to look when the carrying becomes heavier than you expected, and to recognize that the weight is not evidence that something has gone wrong. The weight is the archive. And the archive is what the sequence requires you to have built in order to do what this specific historical moment is asking of you. Enki said in the last legible line of the Soul Classification Council record, and the scribes copied it with the notation that marks the most transmission-critical content in the Eridu corpus. The soul that can hear this is already further along than it thinks. We will leave it there, but there is something we have not addressed directly that the tablets include in what appears to be a supplementary passage, added after the main classification record was sealed. The supplementary passage is in a different hand than the primary text, which the scholars examining it have interpreted as either a later addition by a different scribe or a contemporaneous addition that was appended after the primary classification was considered complete. Either way, it is in the corpus, and it addresses something the main text treats only by implication. The supplementary passage asks, what happens to the soul that is in genuine doubt about its current stage? Not the doubt that is actually the fourth stage's false map discovery presenting itself as epistemological humility. Not the doubt that is the fifth stage's non-sequential memory disorientation presenting itself as fundamental uncertainty. The genuine structural doubt of a soul that, after honest encounter with the classification system and honest encounter with its own experience, cannot locate itself clearly in the sequence. The tablets say this kind of genuine structural doubt is itself a stage indicator, not a precise one. It is available across a range of stages, and the doubt has different qualities at different positions in the sequence. But the capacity to hold genuine doubt about one's own position in the classification, without immediately resolving the doubt into either false certainty or false humility, without either claiming a stage to relieve the disorientation, or disclaiming the entire framework to avoid the vulnerability of being seen, is itself evidence of an archive that has developed beyond the early stages where the doubt would not be possible to hold. The early stages do not have the archive depth to produce this quality of genuine structural doubt. The doubt requires enough archive to know what it does not know. That knowing what you do not know is the archive speaking. The supplementary passage then says something that has been described by several researchers as the most unusual claim in the entire soul classification corpus. It says, if you have read this and felt the felt quality of recognition in more than one stage's description, as if you are not cleanly in one stage, but feel echoes of multiple stages simultaneously, this is not evidence that the classification system does not apply to you. It is evidence that you are in a threshold moment. The threshold moments the tablets describe as having the quality of multi-stage simultaneity. The soul in transition between stages does not cleanly leave one and enter the other. There is an overlap period. The prior stage is still present in the archive as a lived reality. The next stage is present as a quality of pulling forward. Both are simultaneously felt. The multi-stage resonance is the overlap period's signature. This means that if you found yourself resonating with multiple stage descriptions while reading this, the resonance is not a sign that the framework is too vague or too broad to be useful. It is a sign that you are actively in a transition. Active transitions are, in the tablet's framework, the most important windows of archive formation available in any given lifetime. The deliberate application of whatever practice corresponds to the stage you are transitioning toward, combined with genuine integration of the stage you are transitioning from, produces the most archive depth per unit of time of any configuration in the sequence. The transition periods are not comfortable. They are also the periods of maximum archive formation efficiency. If you are in one, the tablets say, use it. The window will close. The next window will open eventually. But this one is open now. The supplementary passage ends with a note that appears to be written in a more personal register than the formal classification text. Less council chamber, more like a letter. The scribes preserved it with the same critical content notation that marks the most transmission-important passages. It says, I built this for you, not for the council. They have their own methods. This is for you, who are reading it later. When the council is gone and the temple is gone and the period we were trying to preserve is only in the fragments that survived us. You are reading this because enough of it survived, and enough of your archive has been built to hear it. I did not know who you would be. I knew you would be at a specific stage of the sequence when you encountered this. I built the transmission to reach you at that stage. Whatever stage that is, this was designed to reach you there, not to give you the answer. To give you the recognition that the answer is already in the archive. The archive that you have been building across every crossing. the archive that is in you right now. That is what the tablets say. That is what Enki left. That is what has survived. The question the system asks of every soul that encounters it is not, which stage are you in? The question is, what will you do with the archive you have built? In this period, in this historical moment, with the specific distribution of soul stages that the current pre-reset configuration has produced around you, with the specific weight that your own crossings have deposited in you, with the specific recognition sense that those crossings have calibrated, what will you do with it? The tablets do not answer that question. It is not the tablet's question to answer. It is the soul's question. And the soul that has enough archive to genuinely ask it already knows more of the answer than the question's surface suggests. The 8 stages, the unscribed, the newly marked, the first builder, the turning soul, the hollowed, the bearer, the translucent, the complete. 8 distinct positions in a single continuous sequence. 8 ways of carrying the archive that every soul is building across every crossing it makes through this particular vehicle, in this particular form, in this particular historical window that the tablets say is more significant than most of the souls living in it are aware. The classification is not about rank. The forest needs the sapling and the old growth. The sequence needs every stage. The current moment needs every stage. The ones at the beginning are building the archive that will be carried by the ones at the middle and the end. The ones at the end are maintaining the field conditions in which the ones at the beginning can build. The whole system is in motion simultaneously, and the motion, not any individual stage, is the transmission. The tablets are in the record. The sequence continues. The archive deepens. The transmission moves. The soul that can hear this is already further along than it thinks. Enki said it. The scribes kept it. You have heard it now.